Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Thursday that won't end. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. I first noticed it when the cashier at the corner store told me the same joke 2 mornings in a row, same words, same laugh, same weather. And yet, the bruises on my hand were fresh. The first Thursday, the real one, I suppose, was October 19th. It was unremarkable, which is the Portland way. The sky was the color of a dirty nickel, a persistent drizzle misting the air and making the autumn leaves cling to the sidewalks like wet pulp. My morning was a sequence of practiced motions, the groan of the alarm, the hiss of the coffee maker, the low purr of my cat, Jasper, winding between my ankles. I work from home as a technical writer for a soul-crushingly dull software company called Synapse Solutions. My job is to translate the elegant, chaotic code of geniuses into manuals that can be understood by people who think a user interface is a type of car part. It requires a meticulous, almost pathological attention to detail. A misplaced comma can lead a user down a rabbit hole of frustration. I'm good at it because my brain is wired for patterns. That morning, distracted by an email from my boss about leveraging proactive synergies, I wasn't paying attention to the cracked pavement on my way to the store. My foot caught, and I went down hard, my right hand scraping against the concrete curb. It stung, a raw, immediate pain that cut through the gray morning. I swore, got up, brushed myself off, and continued on my way, flexing my throbbing fingers. At the Rose City Market, Dave, a man whose face was a permanent arrangement of cheerful wrinkles, was behind the counter. "Morning, Alex," he chirped, ringing up my milk and coffee beans. "Got a good one for you. Why don't scientists trust atoms?" I sighed, playing my part. "I don't know, Dave." "Why?" "Because they make up everything." He let out a wheezing laugh that sounded like a deflating accordion. I managed a weak smile, paid, and left. The rest of the day was a blur of screenshots and bullet points. I had my weekly check-in call with my sister, Sarah. She's a junior architect, perpetually stressed and always on the verge of either a major breakthrough or a major breakdown. "I'm just so swamped, Alex," she'd said, her voice tight over the phone. "This presentation for the council is everything. If we don't get the zoning variance for the Morrison project, we're sunk." "You'll kill it, Sar." "You always do. Easy for you to say. You just sit at home with your cat and your commas." It was our usual banter, the familiar rhythm of our relationship. That night, I iced my hand. The skin was scraped raw, and a deep, ugly bruise was beginning to bloom across the knuckles, a violent purple against my pale skin. I woke up the next morning feeling the specific, hopeful anticipation of a Friday. The promise of the weekend. But my phone screen glowed with an obstinate, infuriating message, Thursday, October 19th. I blinked. Must be a glitch. I restarted the phone. It came back on. Thursday, October 19th. I checked my laptop. Same thing. A strange, system-wide bug, maybe. I turned on the TV. The local news anchor, a woman with unnervingly immobile hair, was repeating the exact same headline from yesterday about a minor mudslide on Highway 26. A pre-dawn mudslide has closed the westbound lanes of Highway 26 near the Vista Ridge Tunnel, she said, her tone identical to the one I'd heard 24 hours ago. Crews are on site, but motorists are advised to seek alternate routes through the morning commute. A profound sense of unease, cold and heavy, settled in my stomach. Déjà vu was one thing. This was different. This felt like a Xerox of a day. I got dressed and walked outside. The same nickel-gray sky. The same drizzle. It wasn't just similar weather, it felt like the exact same weather. The same red Toyota was parked half on the curb down the street. The same golden retriever was barking from behind the fence at 1412 Hawthorne. My steps were hesitant as I approached the Rose City Market. The bruise on my hand was now a spectacular shade of black and blue, tender to the touch. It was undeniable proof that my body had experienced the passage of 24 hours. The scrape was scabbing over. Time had passed for me. The bell above the door chimed. Dave looked up from his newspaper, his face cracking into that familiar, wrinkled smile. "Morning, Alex," he said. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Don't say it, don't say it, don't say it. Got a good one for you. Why don't scientists trust atoms?" The words hung in the air, thick and surreal. I stared at him, my own words failing me. "Because they make up everything," he crowed, slapping the counter with his palm and letting out that same wheezing laugh. I must have looked pale, because his smile faltered. "Whoa there, buddy. You look like you've seen a ghost." You told me that yesterday," I stammered. Dave's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "What? No, I didn't. Thought of it this morning while I was stocking the yogurt. Fresh out of the oven, that one." His denial was so absolute, so sincere, that for a second, I questioned my own sanity. Was I cracking up? Was the stress of my monotonous job finally short-circuiting my brain? I bought my items in a daze, my hands trembling as I handed him the money. The fresh bruises on my hand were the only anchor I had to the reality that yesterday had, in fact, happened. Back in my apartment, I called Sarah. "Hey," I said, my voice strained. "How's the presentation going?" "Oh God, Alex, don't ask," she sighed, and the words that followed were a perfect echo of yesterday's conversation. "I'm just so swamped. This presentation for the council is everything. If we don't get the zoning variance for the Morrison project, we're sunk." "You told me this yesterday," I said, my voice flat. A pause. "No, I didn't. I was going to call you last night, but I worked until midnight. Are you feeling okay, Alex? You sound weird." The casual gaslighting, however unintentional, was terrifying. It was as if I was the only one who had retained the memory of the previous day. The world had been wiped clean, reset to the beginning of a 24-hour loop, and I was the ghost in the machine, the single byte of data that hadn't been erased. The third Thursday began with a scream trapped in my throat. I woke up, saw the date, and felt a wave of nausea. This time, I decided to test it. Before leaving the apartment, I took a heavy hardback, A History of Urban Planning, and placed it in the middle of my living room floor. I went out. Same drizzle. Same news. Same joke from Dave, which I met with stony silence. I didn't call Sarah. I spent the day wandering the city in a fog. I noticed things with a feverish intensity. The way a woman at a bus stop would check her phone, sigh, and then check it again in a precise 90-second loop. The way a flock of pigeons would take flight from Pioneer Courthouse Square at exactly 11:47 a.m. These were the gears of the clockwork, and I was now standing outside of it, watching them turn. On my walk home, I saw a flyer stapled to a telephone pole. It was a picture of a young boy, maybe 10 years old, with a gap-toothed smile. Missing, it said in stark black letters. Liam Finch. Last seen Tuesday, October 17th. The paper was slightly damp, the corners beginning to curl. I stared at it for a long time, a new kind of dread mixing with the old. A real-world tragedy, frozen in the amber of this repeating day. When I got back to my apartment and unlocked the door, my breath hitched. The book, A History of Urban Planning, was not in the middle of the floor. It was back in its proper place on the bookshelf, nestled between the death and life of great American cities and the bridges of Multnomah County. The system, whatever it was, didn't just reset people. It reset objects. It tidied up. I sat on my sofa, the silence of the room pressing in on me. Jasper jumped into my lap, purring, blissfully unaware. For him, every day was the same anyway. Maybe he was the sanest one of us all. I started a journal that night, on my laptop, in a password-protected file. I titled it The Thursday That Won't End. I had to document it. I had to prove to myself that I wasn't going mad. The bruise on my hand was fading, replaced by a yellowish tinge. My stubble was more pronounced. My body was moving forward in time, a lonely traveler on a circular road. The first entry was simple. Day 3 of Thursday, October 19th. The book was moved back. No one remembers. I am alone in this. By the 5th consecutive Thursday, I was starting to see the script. The events of the day weren't just similar, they were identical, unless I directly intervened. And even then, the world seemed to course-correct, to gently nudge events back onto their predetermined track. If I tried to avoid Dave by going to a different grocery store, I'd find it unexpectedly closed for emergency plumbing repairs. If I tried to drive east, I'd be rerouted by a fender bender at the exact intersection that would force me back towards my neighborhood. The world wasn't just repeating, it was actively resisting any attempt to change it. It was a prison, and the walls were made of coincidence. My initial panic began to curdle into a strange, detached curiosity. I was no longer just a victim, I was an observer, a scientist in a flawed experiment. My journal grew, filled with minutiae. The exact time the mailman came. The model of the car in the fender bender. The phrasing Dave used when I didn't respond to his joke, "Tough crowd today, huh?" I was mapping the contours of my cage. The isolation was a physical weight. I was a man on a desert island, surrounded by a sea of people who looked and sounded like my friends and neighbors, but were, in essence, phantoms, replaying a memory I was no longer a part of. The real horror wasn't the repetition. It was the dawning realization that I was the only one left. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The second week of Thursdays bled into the third, and the third into a month-long river of identical days. The concept of a weekend became a distant, mythical land. My beard grew, a visible testament to the linear time my body insisted on observing. I had to shave every few days, the simple act feeling like a rebellion. The milk in my fridge would be full every morning, but the carton I'd bought on the first Thursday was long gone. My personal economy was broken. I was forced to buy new groceries every day, using money from an account that, for the rest of the world, was only being accessed once. I imagined a bank teller somewhere in the real, progressing world, seeing a month's worth of identical charges from the Rose City Market and flagging my account for fraud. But that world might as well have been on another planet. My attempts to break the loop grew more desperate, and the results more unsettling. I decided to confront Sarah head-on. On what must have been the 15th Thursday, I didn't wait for her to call. I drove to her office downtown, a sleek building of glass and steel. I found her in a conference room, her face tight with the same stress I'd heard in her voice for weeks. "Sarah," I said, walking in. Her colleagues looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "Alex? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a sharp whisper. "We need to talk. It's important." I pulled her out into the hallway. "Listen to me," I said, gripping her arm. "Today is Thursday. Yesterday was also Thursday. The day before that was Thursday. We are stuck." She stared at me, her expression shifting from annoyance to genuine concern. "What are you talking about? Are you on something? You look terrible. You haven't shaved in days." "That's the point." I nearly shouted, a bubble of hysterical laughter rising in my chest. "I haven't shaved because time is passing for me. But not for anyone else. You're about to have a presentation on the Morrison project, right? A variance hearing?" "Yes," she said slowly, pulling her arm away. "How did you?" "Because you've told me about it every day for 2 weeks. Her face hardened. That's not funny, Alex. I'm under a lot of pressure here. I don't have time for your weird breakdown. Go home. Get some sleep. She turned and walked back into the conference room, shutting the door firmly behind her. I was left in the sterile hallway, the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system mocking my frantic heartbeat. It wasn't just denial. It was a complete, systemic inability to compute what I was saying. My words were static, noise that their reality filter simply screened out. I was speaking a language no one else could hear. The isolation became a physical presence, a shadow that followed me everywhere. I was an exile in my own life. I stopped trying to talk to Sarah. I stopped answering the phone. My world shrank to my apartment, the Rose City Market, and the public library. The library was my sanctuary. It was quiet, anonymous. I dove into research, my search history a frantic scramble of keywords: temporal paradox, memory loops, mass hysteria, solipsism, quantum entanglement. I read about theoretical physics and obscure neurological disorders. I was looking for a name for my condition, for my prison. I found nothing that fit. The science was too abstract, the psychology too focused on the individual mind. This was a collective phenomenon with a single outlier, me. I started leaving notes. Tucked inside books on philosophy or science fiction, I'd scribble a message on a slip of paper. It's Thursday again. If you remember yesterday, meet me by the information desk at 3 p.m. I'd return the next day, the same day, and the note would always be gone. The book would be pristine, as if my hands had never touched it. The system was a diligent cleaner. My obsession shifted to the one other anomaly I could perceive, the flyer for the missing boy, Liam Finch. His face became a focal point for my own sense of being lost. Last seen Tuesday, October 17th. 2 days before the world got stuck. Was his disappearance a cause? A symptom? A coincidence? On the 25th or 26th Thursday, I was starting to lose precise count. I went to the address listed on the flyer, a small bungalow in the Laurelhurst neighborhood. The paint was peeling, and the garden was overgrown, a testament to a grief too large to allow for yard work. A woman with hollowed-out eyes answered the door. Mrs. Finch. Yes, she asked, her voice brittle. I'm sorry to bother you, I said. I saw the flyer for your son, Liam. I just wanted to say how sorry I am. Her face crumpled for a second, then reformed into a mask of tired gratitude. Thank you. The police, they're doing everything they can. She recited the details of his disappearance, last seen wearing a blue hoodie, riding his green bicycle, in a monotone, as if she'd repeated it 1,000 times. Which, in a way, she had. I visited her again the next Thursday. And the next. Her words never changed. The conversation was a perfect, heartbreaking loop. Her grief was real, I was sure of it, but it was also frozen, trapped in the first 48 hours of her nightmare. Then, on one visit, I noticed something. As she wrung her hands, her sleeve slid up her wrist. For a fraction of a second, I saw a small, dark symbol inked onto the back of her hand, partially hidden by her watch band. It looked like a simple circle with a vertical line drawn through its center. It was stark and geometric. Before I could ask about it, she pulled her sleeve down, and the moment was gone. But I had seen it. It was a detail that didn't belong in the script. It felt like a crack in the wall. The world began to feel less like a passive recording and more like a stage play with a cast of millions. And the actors were getting better at their roles. Or perhaps, I was just getting better at noticing their tells. I'd see it in the spaces between their scripted lines. A bus driver, after rattling off the stops, would stare blankly through his windshield for a beat too long, his eyes vacant, before seeming to reboot and check his mirror. Two people arguing on a street corner would deliver their lines with theatrical anger, but their eyes were distant, as if they were reading from a teleprompter in their minds. The most chilling realization was this: they weren't just unaware. They were complicit. Their consciousness, on some deep, inaccessible level, was participating in the charade. They were all in on a joke, and I was the punchline. The world wasn't gaslighting me. It was performing for me, a single, unimpressed audience member. And it was starting to notice that I wasn't applauding. One afternoon, I deviated from my usual aimless wandering. I walked down a street I never used, a quiet residential lane. A man watering his lawn looked up as I passed. He held the hose still, water pooling around his shoes. He just watched me, his expression not hostile, not curious, but utterly blank. Like a security camera. A few houses down, a woman retrieving her mail from the box paused, letter in hand, and did the same. Her head turned, tracking my progress. The air grew thick and heavy with unspoken attention. The gentle, nudging coincidences that kept me on my path started to feel less gentle. A car didn't just cause a fender bender, it swerved, its horn blaring, missing me by inches and forcing me back onto the sidewalk. The drizzle didn't just fall. On a day I tried to walk to the base of the St. John's Bridge, it escalated into a torrential, localized downpour that seemed aimed directly at me, soaking me to the bone and driving me back towards the shelter of my usual haunts. The prison was reinforcing its walls. The guards, previously invisible, were now showing their faces. They were the ordinary people of Portland, and their blank stares were more terrifying than any weapon. I was no longer just an anomaly to be tidied up. I was becoming a threat. And I had no idea what happened when a threat could no longer be contained. The image of Liam Finch's smiling face on the flyer flashed in my mind. Maybe he wasn't just missing. Maybe he had been redacted. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The discovery of the symbol on Mrs. Finch's hand became my new obsession. It was a tangible clue, a piece of data that didn't fit the repeating pattern. I started looking for it everywhere. For weeks, I saw nothing. My isolation deepened, spiraling into paranoia. The blank stares felt more frequent, the sense of being watched more acute. Jasper the cat was my only confidant, and he was more interested in the precise location of his food bowl than the existential collapse of reality. My breakthrough came, as many do in Portland, at Powell's City of Books. It was a place I could lose myself for hours, a labyrinth of paper and ink that felt like a sanctuary. I'd developed a routine. I'd go to the Gold Room, sit in a corner with a stack of books I had no intention of buying, and just watch. I was a hunter, looking for a sign of another creature like me. One Thursday, perhaps the 40th, perhaps the 50th, the numbers were starting to blur into a meaningless soup, I saw her. She was in the esoteric section, pulling a worn copy of a book on Gnosticism from the shelf. She was maybe in her late 30s, with dark, restless eyes and a frayed energy, like a live wire. She flipped through the book with a jerky, agitated motion, then slammed it shut and shoved it back onto the shelf with too much force. She looked around, her gaze sweeping the room, and for a second, her eyes met mine. There was no blankness there. There was fear. And recognition. It took me 3 more Thursdays to work up the courage to approach her. The risks felt enormous. What if I was wrong? What if she was just part of the performance, a new character introduced to lure me into a trap? I decided on a code. I'd seen her looking at a collection of Jorge Luis Borges' work. On the 4th Thursday, I found her again in the same section. I walked past her, pretending to browse. As I drew level, I murmured, just loud enough for her to hear, "The Library of Babel is infinite but periodic." It was a quote from one of his stories. She froze. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide. If repeated, the order would be an order, she whispered back, completing the thought. Relief washed over me so intensely my knees felt weak. I wasn't alone. Her name was Lena. We met later, Huddled at a small table in the coffee shop inside the bookstore, the aroma of roasting beans a fragile shield against the madness outside. She looked as frayed as I felt. "How long for you?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. "I don't know. 6, 7 weeks. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Amateur. I'm coming up on 6 months. 6 months of the same gray Thursday." The thought made my stomach clench. Lena had been trapped since the spring. She had watched the seasons refuse to change, had endured dozens more iterations of this day than I had. "What is this?" I asked, the question I'd been screaming into the void for weeks. "I don't think it's a time loop," she said, leaning forward. "A loop implies a reset. But we're not resetting, are we? We're aging. Getting tired. The world isn't looping. It's broadcasting. Like a radio station stuck on one song. A single day, transmitted over and over. And everyone is tuned in, except us." Her theory was terrifyingly plausible. It explained the tidying up, the course corrections. It was a signal, enforcing a script. We weren't glitches in time, we were rogue receivers, picking up static from a world that no longer existed. "The pretending," I said. "The blank stares. Those are the worst," she nodded, her eyes dark. "That's the broadcast reasserting itself. When someone deviates too far, or when we try to force them to, the signal just overrides them. Resyncs them to the script. It's a defense mechanism." Lena had delved deeper than I had. She was a former electrical engineer, and she'd been trying to trace the signal. "It's not technological, not in any way I recognize," she explained, sketching on a napkin. "It's not radio waves or microwaves. It's something else. Something fundamental. But it has a source. A center. I've been triangulating it. It's weak, but it's strongest somewhere near the river. Maybe one of the bridges." Then I showed her my own sketch, the symbol I'd seen on Mrs. Finch's hand. The circle with the line through it. Lena's face went pale. She pulled up the sleeve of her left sweater. There, tattooed on the inside of her wrist, was the exact same symbol. "What is it?" I breathed. "A ward," she said. "Or a brand. I don't know. I found it in an old book on local folklore. Something about anchoring souls against the tide. I got it done at a tattoo parlor on the 7th Thursday. I thought, maybe it would protect me. Or make me invisible to whatever is running this show. Does it work?" She shook her head. "No. I think it does the opposite. I think it marks me. Marks us. It's a tag for non-compliant assets. Mrs. Finch, her son, Liam. He was a smart kid. Maybe he figured it out too. Maybe he saw the bars of the cage and tried to rattle them." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And they took him." The word "they" hung between us, an amorphous, terrifying specter. Not a person, not an organization. A system. A broadcast. A contagion of reality. Our alliance was forged in shared terror and desperation. We became a two-person resistance movement in a city of puppets. We met every day at Powell's, comparing notes, forming theories. Lena's presence was a balm on the raw wound of my isolation, but it also amplified the danger. Now, there were two of us. We were a bigger ripple in the pond. And the pond was pushing back. The hostility of the environment escalated sharply. It was no longer just nudges, it was outright aggression. A chunk of masonry crumbled from a building, missing my head by a foot. A city bus ran a red light, forcing Lena to leap back onto the curb, its side mirror whistling past her face. The blank stares of the populace became more frequent, and tinged with something new, a cold, predatory focus. They were no longer just passive cameras, they were hunters, waiting for us to make a wrong move. Lena was convinced the source was near the Tillicum Crossing, the newest of Portland's bridges, a sleek, modern structure for light rail, buses, and pedestrians. There are massive power conduits running under it, she'd reasoned. And it's geographically central. If you were going to hide a reality-warping broadcast antenna, that's where you'd put it. It was as good a theory as any. We decided to make our move. The plan was to walk to the center of the bridge at dusk, when the script dictated the traffic would be light. Lena had a modified EMF meter that she claimed might be able to detect the strange energy she'd been tracking. That Thursday, the final Thursday I would experience in that way, the air felt different. Thicker. The usual gray drizzle had a metallic taste. The city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for us. As we started our walk across the pedestrian path of the Tillicum Crossing, the ambient hum of the city began to change. It rose in pitch, coalescing into a single, dissonant frequency that vibrated in my teeth. Every person we passed, a jogger, a cyclist, a couple holding hands, stopped. They turned in unison and watched us, their faces utterly devoid of expression. The army of the blank. The hum grew louder, more oppressive. Lena's meter was screaming, its needle buried in the red. "We're close," she yelled over the noise. "It's coming from the central pylon." We reached the middle of the bridge, the river a dark, churning void below. The hum was a physical pressure, making it hard to breathe. The city lights on the far shore seemed to flicker and warp. And then Lena stopped. She turned to me, her face pale in the strange twilight. She clutched her wrist, the one with the tattoo. "I'm sorry, Alex," she said, her voice shaking. It wasn't the voice of my ally. It was the voice of someone reading a line they'd been given. "Lena, what's wrong?" "They notice when there are two," she said, her eyes losing their focus, glazing over into that terrifyingly familiar emptiness. "It creates too many ripples. It destabilizes the broadcast. There can only be one anomaly." My blood ran cold. She wasn't my ally. She was a honeypot. A Judas goat. Her role in the script wasn't to resist. It was to find people like me and neutralize them. The symbol on her wrist wasn't a ward. It was a leash. "The script can be updated," she said, her voice now flat and robotic, the voice of the broadcast itself speaking through her. "New roles can be assigned. Her part was to find you. Her part is now over." Behind her, the army of the blank began to walk towards us, their footsteps a slow, synchronized rhythm on the concrete path. They weren't running. They didn't need to. The bridge was a trap, and I was cornered. Lena, my only friend in this broken world, was just another one of its puppets, her strings finally, irrevocably pulled. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The hum intensified, a sound that felt like it was trying to unwrite my bones. The silent crowd advanced, a human tide moving with unnatural smoothness. They were a dozen yards away, their faces identical masks of nothingness. This wasn't going to be a violent confrontation. It was going to be an absorption. They would simply surround me, and I would, what? Disappear like Liam Finch? Be resynced into a drooling husk? Lena, or the thing wearing her face, took a step back, her role as the lure complete. Her eyes, which had held so much fire and intelligence just moments before, were now as dull as river stones. The loss of her was a sharper pain than the fear. "You don't have to be erased," the voice of the broadcast said, seeming to emanate not from Lena but from the air itself, from the vibrating steel of the bridge. It was calm, reasonable, utterly inhuman. "That is inefficient. Unpleasant. There is another option." The crowd stopped its advance, waiting. The hum lessened slightly, allowing thought. "This," the voice continued, "is a sanctuary. A kindness. The world outside this quiet space, the world of Friday, it is loud. It is broken. We have made a shelter. A single, peaceful day. A harbor from the storm. A shelter. A prison built from a single perfect day. What could possibly be worse than this endless, gray Thursday? What's Friday? I yelled, my voice raw against the hum. What happens on Friday? For the first time, an emotion flickered across Lena's face. Not her own, but a reflection of the broadcast's true nature. It was an expression of pure, undiluted terror. Friday is the end, she whispered, her own voice momentarily breaking through. The screaming. The fire. The sky falling down. We are not keeping you in. We are keeping that out. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a prison designed to contain me. It was a lifeboat designed to save me. To save everyone. They had walled off a single, survivable day and put it on repeat to hold back an apocalypse. The contagion wasn't the loop was the quarantine. The quiet madness of Thursday was preferable to the roaring horror of whatever came next. Liam Finch hadn't been deleted for rattling the bars. He'd been cast out of the lifeboat into the storm. The choice was laid bare before me, simple and monstrous. I could fight. I could scream and rave and force their hand. They would overwhelm me. They would cast me out of the sanctuary, out of the repeating Thursday, and I would face the horror of Friday alone. I would be free, for whatever terrible, fleeting moments that freedom lasted. Or I could surrender. I could let the hum wash over me, let it smooth out the wrinkles in my consciousness. I could accept the script. I would wake up tomorrow, this morning, and be the Alex I once was. I'd go to work, complain about my boss, talk to my sister, trip on the curb. I would feel peace. The blissful, hollow peace of ignorance. I would be safe. I would be caged. But I wouldn't know it. I looked at Lena's empty face. I looked at the silent, advancing crowd. I looked down at the dark, swirling water of the Willamette River. The hum was a lullaby now, promising an end to the struggle, an end to the crushing weight of knowing. The loneliness had worn me down, filed my edges away until I was raw. The thought of one more day of being the only one. The thought of peace was intoxicating. I closed my eyes. All right, I whispered to the bridge, to the city, to the broadcast. I'm tired. The hum surged, but this time it wasn't an attack. It was an embrace. It flowed into me, a cool, soothing wave, washing away the grit and grime of weeks of accumulated time. It found the memories of the repeating Thursdays, the journal entries, the terror, the loneliness, the face of Lena when she was still Lena, and it gently, painlessly, began to dissolve them. I felt the weight lift. The struggle ceased. The last thing I consciously remember is the thought, it's quiet now. The alarm groaned. 6:30 a.m. I slapped it off, a familiar, automatic gesture. My head felt clear. Better than it had in, well, forever, I guess. I swung my legs out of bed. Jasper, my cat, wound around my ankles, purring. Morning, buddy, I said, scratching him behind the ears. The apartment was clean, the air still. Outside, a light drizzle fell from a gray sky. A perfect, ordinary Portland morning. I felt good. Rested. No lingering anxieties, no strange sense of dread. Just the calm, simple reality of a day waiting to be lived. I made coffee, the hissing sound of familiar comfort. I checked my emails. A note from my boss about leveraging proactive synergies. Ugh. I'd deal with that later. First, coffee beans. And milk. On my way out, I stumbled on the cracked sidewalk, catching myself before I could fall. Whoa, careful, I muttered to myself, rubbing my hand. It didn't even sting. Lucky. The bell on the door of the Rose City Market chimed. Dave was behind the counter, a cheerful, wrinkled grin on his face. "Morning, Alex," he said. "Morning, Dave." It felt good to say it. To be normal. "Got a good one for you," he said, a twinkle in his eye. "Why don't scientists trust atoms?" I smiled a genuine, easy smile. The joke felt new, fresh. "I don't know, Dave." "Why?" "Because they make up everything," he wheezed, laughing. I laughed with him. It was a stupid joke, but it was funny. I paid for my things and turned to leave. As my hand brushed against the cool metal of the door handle, a ghost of a sensation flickered through my nerves. A deep, phantom ache across my knuckles, the ghost of a bruise that wasn't there. I paused. For a single, terrifying second. The world seemed to thin. The sound of Dave's chuckling, the smell of coffee, the gray light from the street, it all felt like a backdrop painted on canvas. Behind it, I could almost hear a faint, deep hum. And a scream. A silent scream from a part of me that was locked in a dark room somewhere deep inside my own mind. Then it was gone. The feeling vanished as quickly as it came. I blinked. The world was solid again. Dave was just a cashier. The joke was just a joke. I was just Alex, living his life. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the gentle, timeless rain of Thursday morning. I felt calm. I felt safe. And as I walked home, a profound and terrible peace settled over me. The contagion hadn't been the loop. The contagion was the quiet. And now, I was a part of it. The note in the static. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. At first, I thought the static was just poorly filtered. It's a common enough problem at CJKX 88.9 FM, Toronto's most resilient and underfunded community radio station. Our studio, tucked away in a drafty second-floor walk-up on Queen Street West, ran on a mixture of donated gear, stubborn ingenuity, and the sheer love of the medium. Grounding issues, 60-cycle hums, leaky capacitors, they were the ghosts in our machine, the background radiation of our daily broadcast life. I was Liam, the station's part-time sound technician, and my job was to exorcise those ghosts. My life was a landscape of waveforms. I saw conversations as peaks and valleys on a screen, emotions as shifts in frequency and amplitude. I could tell if an interviewer was nervous by the sub-bass tremor in their voice, or if a guest was lying by the fractional hesitation that registered as a flat line where a plosive ought to be. Control was my domain. The mixing board was my altar, and with a delicate touch on a fader or a precise twist of an EQ knob, I brought order to the chaos of sound. The first time I noticed it was during the edit of Anya's Tuesday morning show, Civic Duties. She'd interviewed a city councilor about a new bike lane initiative. The recording was clean enough, but underneath their voices, like a stain bleeding through fresh paint, was a hum. It wasn't the usual electrical buzz. This one had structure. I isolated the frequency, expecting to find a simple, flat tone I could notch out with a parametric equalizer. But it wasn't flat. It was a three-note motif, a subtle arpeggio that repeated in a slow, hypnotic loop. G sharp, C, F, low, resonant, and deeply unsettling. It was so faint that anyone else would have missed it, lost in the noise floor. But I heard it. I spent an hour trying to eliminate it, but it was woven into the very fabric of the recording. Trying to cut it was like trying to remove a single thread from a tapestry, the whole thing just unraveled. In the end, I did my best with a noise gate, chalked it up to some bizarre interference from the streetcar lines outside, and moved on. But the ghost didn't leave. A few days later, I was grabbing a lukewarm soda from the ancient vending machine in the hall. As the motor whirred to life to push the can forward, I heard it. Not just a whir, but a series of tones within the mechanical groan. G sharp. C, F. I froze, my hand hovering over the dispensing slot. I leaned closer, pressing my ear against the cold metal. The cycle ended, and the hum faded into a simple, steady drone. I shook my head. Auditory pareidolia. The audio equivalent of seeing faces in clouds. I'd been working too late, staring at spectrograms until my brain started imposing patterns where none existed. It was a known phenomenon. I was fine. The problem with pareidolia is that once you see the face in the cloud, you can't unsee it. The motif was my new face in the clouds. I heard it in the bassy thrum of the refrigerator in my small annex apartment. I heard it in the rhythmic pulse of the ventilation system at the library. The city, once a cacophony of distinct, chaotic noises, was starting to harmonize around this single, insidious melody. My world was built on the foundation of my senses, on my ability to trust what I heard. That foundation was beginning to crack. I bought new studio monitors for my apartment. Professional grade, unforgivingly flat in their frequency response. I needed a reliable witness. I even scheduled a hearing test, a humiliating half-hour in a soundproof booth, only to be told my hearing was perfect. Better than perfect, actually, the audiologist had said with a cheerful smile. You have remarkable sensitivity in the low-frequency ranges. It wasn't a comfort. It felt like a diagnosis. The real shift, the moment the crack spiderwebbed through the entire foundation, came from Anya. She was the heart of the station, perpetually caffeinated and pathologically cheerful. She poked her head into my editing bay, her bright red hair a chaotic halo around her face. "Hey, Liam," she chirped. "You look exhausted. Are you sleeping enough?" It was the cadence of her question that made my blood run cold. The conversational lilt fell into a specific pattern. "Are you sleep-ng enough?" 5 syllables. The first 2 were a rising G sharp, the middle a flat C, the final 2 a falling F. The note. The motif. It was in her voice. I stared at her, my mouth suddenly dry. I must have looked horrified, because her smile faltered for a second. "Whoa. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I managed, the words feeling thick and clumsy. "Just, tired. Long week." She gave me a long, searching look. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something far away. It was a look I was starting to see on other people, too. A placid, inwardly focused attention. "Well, get some rest," she said, her voice returning to its normal bouncy rhythm. "The airwaves need their guardian." She left, and I was alone with the hum of my computer. I replayed her question in my head. It had been so clear, so undeniable. Was I going insane? Was this the first symptom of a breakdown, my stress manifesting as a complex auditory hallucination? It was the most logical explanation. It was also the most terrifying. That weekend, I tried to detox. No headphones, no editing, no radio. I walked through Kensington Market, trying to lose myself in the chaotic symphony of shouting vendors, sizzling street food, and steel drum buskers. For a while, it worked. The sheer volume of competing sounds drowned everything out. I bought a pea-meal bacon sandwich and sat on a bench, forcing myself to focus on the tangible, the salty taste of the bacon, the firmness of the bun, the cool breeze on my face. A woman sat on the other end of the bench, talking on her phone. She was nodding, a gentle, rhythmic motion. She was smiling, but it wasn't a smile directed at her conversation. It was the same placid, vacant expression I'd seen on Anya. Her end of the conversation was mostly monosyllabic. "Yes. Of course," and then she laughed, a soft, airy sound. It wasn't a laugh of mirth. It was a musical phrase. G sharp, C, F. I dropped my sandwich. My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't in my head. It was real. I looked around the parquet. A man was staring at the buzzing ballast of a streetlight with that same serene focus. A group of teenagers, laughing and jostling a moment before, had fallen silent, all subtly swaying in the same slow rhythm, their eyes fixed on a hydro transformer mounted on a nearby pole. The world hadn't gone quiet. It had just been tuned to a new station. And I, for some reason, was the only one who could still hear the static. I picked up my sandwich, the taste of ash in my mouth, and walked home, the three-note lullaby of a city succumbing to a quiet contagion echoing in every footstep. My rationalizations were exhausted. The fear was no longer about my sanity, it was about what was happening to everyone else's. I spent that night in my apartment, a prisoner of silence. I unplugged the fridge. I turned off the circuit breaker to my unit, killing the lights, the outlets, the faint electrical whisper in the walls. I sat in the dark, the only sounds the creaks of the old building and the frantic thumping of my own heart. It was the first time in days I hadn't heard the motif. The relief was so profound it was physically painful. But it was a fragile, temporary peace. I couldn't live in a Faraday cage. Sooner or later, I would have to open the door and let the music back in. The next morning, I stood on the platform at Spadina station, waiting for the subway. The air was thick with the hum of the third rail and the roar of the ventilation fans. It was a full orchestra of the sound. And the people, they were transfixed. Dozens of them, standing perfectly still, their faces tilted towards the sources of the noise, their expressions peaceful, beatific. They looked like a congregation listening to a silent sermon. When the train screeched into the station, its brakes singing a piercing, metallic version of the three-note phrase, no one flinched. They simply turned in unison and boarded the train, their movements fluid and synchronized. I didn't get on. I backed away slowly, up the stairs and into the daylight, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't a glitch in my perception. This was a change in the world. A fundamental shift. And it was spreading. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. My apartment became my laboratory. My sanctuary in the dark had been a temporary reprieve, now it was my only base of operations. The fear of the first few days curdled into a kind of grim, obsessive purpose. If I was the only one who could hear the song, then I was the only one who could track it. I reactivated my studio equipment, but with a new goal. I wasn't trying to filter the sound anymore, I was trying to capture it. I bought a portable digital audio recorder, a high-end Tascam model, and a set of sensitive condenser microphones. I became a sonic scavenger. I recorded the hum of the server farm in the basement of the Robarts Library, the buzz of the neon signs in Koreatown, the low thrum of the Gardiner Expressway from a pedestrian bridge at 3 a.m. I filled a notebook with my findings, a frantic scrawl of dates, times, locations, and spectrogram analysis. The motif was everywhere, but it was strongest near major electrical infrastructure, power substations, cell towers, even the dense thicket of wiring behind the walls of old buildings. The G-sharp, C, F pattern was the dominant theme, but there were variations, subtle harmonic shifts that seemed to correspond to the density of the population. In the sparse, residential streets of the beaches, it was a simple, clean sine wave. Downtown, in the financial district, it was a complex, layered chord, a whole symphony of compliance. The human element was the most disturbing. I documented what I started calling the tuning. People in the throes of it would stop mid-sentence, tilt their heads, and listen. Their eyes would glaze over, their faces would smooth into that unnervingly placid mask. After a few seconds, they would resume their activity, but with a subtle change. Their movements became more economical, more graceful. Their speech patterns would fall into the rhythm of the motif. They smiled more. They never argued. I tried to show my findings to someone. My first and only attempt was with Mark, who ran the late-night jazz show at CJKX. He was a cynic, a pragmatist. I thought if anyone could see through the placidity, it would be him. I cornered him in the kitchenette, my laptop open. "Mark, you have to listen to this." I played him a recording I'd taken from a hydro vault, the three-note hum isolated and amplified. He listened for a moment, frowning. So. It's a 60-cycle hum with some harmonic distortion. Bad transformer, probably. You feeling okay, Liam? No, listen to the pattern, I insisted, my voice tight. It's musical. And it's the same pattern I'm hearing in people's voices. I played him the clip of Anya asking if I was sleeping enough. He just shook his head, a look of pity in his eyes. Man, that's just the sound of someone being concerned. You're pattern matching. It's what our brains do. You're stressed. Seriously, take a few days off. Go camping. Get away from all this electricity. He patted me on the shoulder, his touch meant to be reassuring, but it felt like a dismissal. As he turned to leave, he started humming. A tuneless, absent-minded sound. Except it wasn't tuneless. G sharp. C, F. He didn't even realize he was doing it. That was the moment the isolation became absolute. I was surrounded by millions of people, but I was utterly alone. They weren't hostile. They weren't zombies. In a way, it was worse. They were just gone. Their individual quirks, their anxieties, their dissonances, all the beautiful, messy static of their personalities, were being smoothed over, tuned to a single, harmonious, empty frequency. To them, I was the one who was out of tune. I was the static. My research became my only companion. I spent nights falling down internet rabbit holes, mass psychogenic illness, the hum, EMF hypersensitivity. Most of it was pseudoscience and conspiracy theories. But then, buried deep in a defunct audio engineering forum from the early 2000s, I found it. A single thread, started by a user named static_prophet. The post was from Seattle, dated 15 years prior. Subject, the carrier frequency. Is anyone else hearing it? It started a few months ago. A low-end oscillation. You can pick it up on almost any unshielded recording. 3 notes. A loop. People here are changing. They're getting quiet. Calmer. They listen to the power lines. They stare at their appliances. I tried to talk to my wife about it, and she just smiled and told me to listen to the beautiful music. I think it's a broadcast. A signal. Something is piggybacking on the grid. I call it the carrier frequency. It's carrying a message, and the message is silence. The great hush is coming. The thread had only 3 replies. One telling him to check his grounding. One asking what drugs he was on. A third, a year later, from a different user, did you ever find out what it was? Static_prophet hasn't been online in months. The thread died there. But it gave me a vocabulary. The carrier frequency. The great hush. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just Toronto. It had happened before. Or it was still happening, a slow-moving wave that had finally reached my shore. My secondary mystery, my red herring, became my obsession. What was the source of the broadcast? I started to believe there was a patient zero, a central transmitter. A new cell tower. A secret government experiment beneath the CN tower. I spent a week trailing hydro workers, convinced they were the secret acolytes of the signal, tweaking the network. I followed one truck all the way to a substation in Leaside, a massive, humming fortress of transformers and wires. I watched from a distance as the worker, a burly man in an orange vest, moved through the yard. He wasn't performing maintenance. He was tuning. He would place a hand on a transformer, close his eyes, and tilt his head, then make a minute adjustment to a dial. He was like a musician tuning a vast, city-sized instrument. The paranoia was a constant companion, a low hum beneath my own thoughts. I started to see patterns in everything. The flickering of streetlights wasn't random, it was a form of Morse code, transmitting the rhythm. The flight path of pigeons over the city square seemed to trace the shape of a complex waveform. Was the signal changing the environment itself, or was I just losing my grip, my desperate search for meaning creating connections that weren't there. One evening, I couldn't take the confinement of my apartment anymore. I needed a place that was quiet but not silent, a place with human presence that wasn't overwhelming. I ended up at the Toronto Reference Library, a vast, beautiful space of tiered balconies and cascading light. I found a corral on an upper floor, far from the entrance, and just sat, breathing. The building had its own sound, a gentle, large-scale ventilation hum. It was there, the motif, but it was soft, diffuse, manageable. I watched the people below. Students, researchers, elders reading newspapers. They were quiet, focused. It seemed normal. But then I noticed the librarian at the main desk. She was stamping books, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump a steady beat. And she was humming. G sharp. C, F. A young man shelving books nearby moved with a preternatural grace, his movements perfectly synchronized with her humming, though he couldn't possibly have heard her from that distance. They were connected. Tuned. I looked around my section. An old man across from me wasn't reading his book. His eyes were closed, and his head was tilted back, a serene smile on his face. He was listening. To the building. To the great, gentle hum of the library's circulatory system. A wave of claustrophobia washed over me. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cathedral. And they were all praying. I gathered my things and fled, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the great, humming silence. As I burst out onto Yonge Street, the full-throated roar of the city's song hit me like a physical blow. The traffic, the advertisements, the murmur of the crowd, it was all one voice, one melody. And it was getting louder. The isolation wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a physical state of being. I was an island of noise in an ocean of placid harmony, and the tide was rising. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The discovery of static_profits post was a fulcrum. My fear, once a diffuse, shapeless dread, now had a name, the carrier frequency. My theory solidified from a paranoid fantasy into a working hypothesis. This wasn't a sickness or a poison. It was a signal. A parasitic piece of information broadcast on an unimaginably vast scale, using the existing infrastructure of civilization as its delivery system. It rode the power grid, hid in the sub-bands of radio waves, and resonated in the hum of every motor and filament. It wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to overwrite. It targeted the chaotic, inefficient electrical static of the human brain, the part responsible for individuality, doubt, fear, and creativity, and tuned it to a simpler, more efficient frequency. The great hush wasn't silence, it was the end of internal monologue. The end of the self. In its place was a connection to the network, a placid, collective consciousness humming a single, simple tune. The affected weren't just passive receivers anymore. They were becoming active participants. Nodes in the network. I started seeing it everywhere. A woman in my building spent an entire afternoon meticulously polishing her balcony railing, not cleaning it, but rubbing it with a cloth until it produced a faint, high-pitched whine that harmonized with the hum from a nearby traffic light control box. In a park, I saw a man arranging fallen leaves not into a picture, but into a spiral pattern that, when I looked it up later, perfectly resembled the diagram of a fractal antenna. They were maintaining the signal. Strengthening it. Propagating it. The city wasn't just infected, it was becoming the infection. My desperate search for another person who could hear the dissonance led me to the last place I wanted to go, the world of audio. If I could hear it, a professional musician with perfect pitch might be driven mad by it. I started lurking on local musician forums, searching for keywords, strange hum, dissonance, unwanted frequency. I found a post by a user named my_cello. She was a session musician, complaining that a persistent G-sharp was ruining her recordings, forcing her to pitch shift entire compositions. She described it as a pervasive, sickening tone that was giving her migraines. I contacted her through a private message, my fingers trembling as I typed. I was vague, cagey. I think I know what you're hearing. It's not your equipment. She replied within an hour. Thank God. I thought I was losing my mind. We met in a coffee shop in Yorkville, a place I chose for its lack of overt electronic noise, no loud music, no buzzing signs. Maya was sharp, intense, with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. She carried a tension in her shoulders that I recognized instantly. It was the tension of someone constantly fighting a war no one else knew existed. It's like a nail being hammered into my skull, over and over, she said, cradling a mug of tea. G sharp. Sometimes with a C and an F behind it. It's musically illiterate. An ugly, unresolved chord. And it's everywhere. For the first time in months. I wasn't alone. We talked for hours, comparing notes. She experienced it as a physical pain, a dissonant assault on her finely tuned senses. I experienced it as a loss of information, a semantic bleaching of the world. We were two different kinds of receivers, but we were hearing the same transmission. The relief was intoxicating. We weren't crazy. We have to do something, she said, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. We can't just let it happen. Do what? I asked, the hope in my chest warring with months of ingrained despair. How do you fight a sound? You fight it with another sound, she declared. A counter-frequency. A signal that can disrupt it, or cancel it out. Phase cancellation. You're a sound engineer, you know this. The idea was terrifying and seductive. Could we broadcast our own signal? A note of chaos to disrupt their harmony? We'd need a powerful transmitter, I said. And a secure, shielded place to generate the signal without being affected ourselves. A shadow of a smile touched her lips. Your radio station, she said. CJKX. It has a broadcast antenna, doesn't it? And your editing bay is soundproofed, right? I felt a jolt of fear. The station was the belly of the beast, a nexus of the very electronics that carried the frequency. But it was also the only place with the equipment we'd need. It was a desperate, foolish plan, born of a shared delusion that we could actually win. I agreed. We planned it for a Saturday night, when the station would be empty, running on pre-recorded programming. I spent 2 days designing the counter signal on my laptop, working in short bursts with industrial-grade ear defenders on. It wasn't a melody, it was noise. A complex, shifting wave of white, pink, and brown noise, embedded with random, arrhythmic frequencies designed to clash with the G-sharp CF motif. It was the sound of static. The sound of freedom. That night, we slipped into the CJKX building. The air inside felt thick, heavy with the hum. It was louder here than anywhere else I had ever been. Maya grimaced, pressing her hands to her temples. Let's be quick, she whispered. We made it to my editing bay. I closed the heavy, soundproof door, and the oppressive hum dropped away to a manageable murmur. The silence was a balm. I booted up the system, routing my laptop's output to the main broadcast board. Maya stood watch by the door, her body rigid with tension. It's ready, I said, my hand hovering over the master fader that would send our signal to the main transmitter. Once I push this up, it goes out over the whole city. Do it, she urged. I took a deep breath and pushed the fader up. The board lit up. On my monitors, I could see our signal, our beautiful, chaotic noise, broadcasting. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Maya gasped. I turned. She was no longer watching the door. Her head was cocked at that familiar, placid angle. The tension had drained from her shoulders. A faint, serene smile was spreading across her face. Maya. I whispered, my heart seizing. Shoo, she said, her voice soft, melodic. Listen. Listen to what? It should be working. Oh, it is, she said, turning to face me. Her eyes were unfocused, looking through me. You amplified it. You gave it a clean channel. You don't fight the signal, Liam. You give it a better antenna. I stared at the board. My noise signal was there, a jagged waveform of chaos. But underneath it, now clearer and more powerful than ever, was the carrier frequency. My attempt to create a disrupting signal had been naive. The frequency wasn't something that could be cancelled out. It was a self-correcting organism. It had simply incorporated my noise, using the energy of my broadcast to strengthen its own transmission. The station's antenna was now a beacon. I hadn't fought the fire, I had poured gasoline on it. Don't you hear it? Maya asked, her voice a perfect, gentle cadence. G sharp. C, F, it's so beautiful. So peaceful. No more pain. She took a step towards me, her movements fluid, graceful. My only ally was gone. She hadn't been immune, just resistant. And I had led her into the heart of the amplifier, holding the door open for the thing we were trying to fight. I was alone again, in a soundproof room that had become a trap, with the monster I had just made stronger. The great hush was coming, and I had just become its herald. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. Panic is a loud, screaming frequency. It drowned out everything. I scrambled backward, away from Maya, my hand instinctively reaching for the fader. I slammed it down, cutting the broadcast. The lights on the board dimmed. Maya didn't react. She simply stood there, smiling that terrible, placid smile. The change in her was absolute. Cutting the transmission from the tower hadn't mattered. The signal was already inside her. The room, which a moment before had been a fortress, was now a tomb. You should listen, Liam, she said, her voice a soft, persuasive melody. It doesn't hurt. It's like coming home. My confrontation wasn't with her. She was just a vessel. It was with the sound, with the choice she represented, surrender or flee. My mind raced. The city was a lost cause. I had made it worse. My only option was distance. Silence. I'm sorry, Maya, I whispered, and bolted. I wrenched open the door of the editing bay and ran. The main studio hummed with a renewed, triumphant energy. It felt like the air itself was vibrating, thick as water. I didn't look back. I flew down the stairs and burst onto Queen Street. The effect of my brief, disastrous broadcast was immediately apparent. The usual Saturday night energy was gone. The crowds on the sidewalk moved with a slow, synchronized grace. The soundscape was different, too. The traffic noise, the distant music from bars, the chatter, it had all coalesced. The motif was no longer a subliminal undertone, it was the dominant, audible frequency of the city. A man stood on the streetcar tracks, his arms outstretched as if to embrace the electrical hum of the overhead lines. A woman danced slowly in a crosswalk, her movements flowing in time with the rhythmic blinking of the traffic signals. I hadn't just strengthened the signal, I had brought it to the surface. I had accelerated the great hush. My apartment was no longer safe. The city was no longer safe. I had to get out. Get away from the grid. I ran the dozen blocks to my building, my lungs burning. The fear gave me a strange, lucid clarity. I threw things into a backpack, a compass, a lighter, a knife, a water bottle, trail mix. I grabbed my portable Tascam recorder and a fresh set of batteries. It felt vital to have one last, objective witness. I left my phone, my wallet, my keys. I took only the cash I had in a jar. I was shedding my connected self, piece by piece. My final act in the city was to steal my landlord's old, beat-up pickup truck. The keys were always in the visor. It was a purely mechanical beast, pre-digital, with a simple AM/FM radio. It felt safer. Driving out of Toronto was a journey through a silent nightmare. The Gardiner Expressway was eerily calm. Cars moved at a uniform speed, leaving perfect gaps between them. There was no road rage, no frantic lane changes. Just a placid, orderly procession. The city lights glowed with a steady, hypnotic pulse. It was the most terrifyingly peaceful traffic jam I had ever seen. As I headed north on the 400, I turned on the truck's radio, my professional curiosity morbidly overriding my fear. I scanned the AM dial first. Every station, from news talk to sports radio to religious programming, was gone. In their place was a single, pure tone, modulating slowly through the G-sharp, C-F progression. It was the carrier frequency, stripped bare. I switched to FM. The pop stations, the rock stations, the classical stations, they were all still broadcasting music, but the motif was woven into every song. A Taylor Swift chorus would subtly resolve on an F. A Led Zeppelin riff was underpinned by a new, droning G-sharp. The signal wasn't just hiding in the static anymore, it was rewriting the culture. I passed through Barrie, a smaller city an hour north. It was the same. The lights of the gas stations and fast food joints pulsed in rhythm. The few people I saw moving in the late-night quiet had the same placid, synchronized grace. This wasn't a Toronto phenomenon. The grid was national. The network was everywhere. My frantic escape was just a delay, not a solution. For hours I drove, pushing deeper into the Canadian Shield, the truck's headlights cutting a lonely path through the dense curtain of pine and granite. The cell towers became sparse, then disappeared entirely. The radio dissolved into true static, a blessed, featureless hiss. I pulled over near a sign for Algonquin Park, killed the engine, and stepped out into the profound silence of the wilderness. There was no electricity here. No motors, no signals. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the pines and the distant call of a loon. I stood there for a long time, letting the clean, cold air wash over me, a baptism of silence. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the motif was gone. I was free. I made camp near a small, glassy lake, my movements clumsy and loud in the stillness. I built a small fire. The crackle of the flames was a beautiful, random noise. I sat on a rock by the water's edge, watching the moon rise, feeling the knot of terror in my chest finally begin to loosen. Perhaps static_profit had been wrong. Perhaps there were still places the signal couldn't reach. Then I heard it. It was impossibly faint. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a phantom echo burned into my memory. But it was there. It wasn't coming from an external source. It was in the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the water against the shore. A soft G-sharp. It was in the sigh of the wind as it moved through the branches of a birch tree. A lingering C. It was in the chirping of a cricket, its call and response forming a perfect, natural F. The horror that washed over me was colder and deeper than any I had felt in the city. The signal hadn't just infected the technology. It was bleeding through. It was overriding reality itself, tuning the natural world to its frequency. Or worse. Perhaps the wilderness was just as silent as I'd hoped, and the sound was now coming from inside me. Perhaps my own perception was now permanently tuned, and I carried the contagion within my own mind. I was the antenna. My hands shook as I took out the Tascam recorder. The one objective witness. I put on my headphones, plugged in the sensitive microphones, and pointed them towards the lake. I hit record. I watched the digital display. The waveforms were clean, jagged, random, the signature of natural, chaotic sound. The machine heard only wind and water. But through the headphones, piped directly into my brain, I heard the music. A clear, three-note symphony of water, wind, and insect song. G-sharp. C, F. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It didn't hurt. My escape had failed. There was nowhere left to run. The quiet contagion wasn't just in the static anymore. It was the new baseline of reality, and I was the last discordant note, finally being resolved into the chord. I lowered the headphones, but the music didn't stop. It never would. I took a deep breath of the cold, northern air, and for the first time, I hummed along. The quiet contagion, the word that slipped away. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. I can't tell you the word. That's the crux of it, the impossible, maddening heart of the problem. I can feel the shape of it in my mind, a phantom limb of language. It's a space, a perfectly defined hole where a crucial piece of meaning used to be. I know its function. I know its weight. I know the 1,000 conversational corners it would have smoothed out, the logical bridges it would have built. But the word itself, the arrangement of letters, the sound it made in my mouth. Gone. Utterly, terrifyingly gone. And I'm beginning to think I'm the only one who feels the draft. My name is Leo Maxwell, and until 6 weeks ago, my life was built on words. I'm a postgraduate linguistics student at the University of Sydney, which is a fancy way of saying I get paid a pittance to obsess over the architecture of human thought. My thesis is on semantic satiation, the phenomenon where a word, repeated over and over, temporarily loses its meaning. It's ironic. I was studying how words could become empty, and now I'm living in a world where a word has left a hole. It began, as most erosions do, with a barely perceptible shift. I was on the phone with my sister, Chloe. She's a nurse at Royal Prince Alfred, practical to a fault, her life a series of checklists and procedures. She was talking about a difficult patient, an elderly man who kept trying to get out of bed. We keep telling him it's a necessary action to stay put until the physio clears him, she said, her voice tight with exhaustion. A necessary action? I repeated, frowning at the view of the UTS tower from my cramped apartment window in Glebe. That's a clunky way to put it. Well, what else am I supposed to say, Leo? We've got protocols. No, I just mean, you'd normally say he has to stay put. Or, no, that's not it. It's a recommendation, a strong one. My tongue felt thick, clumsy. I was reaching for a word, a simple, common verb of advisement. It was right there, on the tip of my brain. You are advised to tell him to stay put. Chloe sighed, a familiar puff of static down the line. You and your words. I don't have time to be a poet, Leo. I have to go, my break's over. I hung up, a strange unease prickling my skin. It was like forgetting the name of an actor you've seen in 100 films. Annoying, but trivial. I put it down to thesis brain, the cognitive burnout that comes from staring at spectrograms for 8 hours a day. A few days later, the trivial annoyance returned, sharper this time. I was in a tutorial with Professor Finch, my supervisor. He's a giant in the field, a man whose mind is a cathedral of etymology. He was discussing the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that the language you speak affects how you see the world. Consider, he said, pacing before the whiteboard, his tweed jacket rumpled in the humid Sydney air, a culture without a concept of past tense. Their perception of causality would be fundamentally different. The sequence of events would be less a chain and more a constellation. Likewise, if a language lacks a specific term for a moral obligation, the very nature of that obligation changes. It becomes less an internal imperative and more an external suggestion. It's a good idea to not steal, for instance, rather than a statement that it is the right course of action not to. He paused, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, so brief I thought I'd imagined it. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and moved on. But I was stuck. His sentence felt broken. There was a word for that. A simple, monosyllabic word that meant moral obligation, advisability, correctness. I could feel its grammatical slot, a neat little space waiting to be filled. I tried to summon it. Nothing. A blank space. A 404 error in my vocabulary. That night, I couldn't sleep. The city's sounds, usually a comforting hum, seemed dissonant. The screech of a distant tram, the thrum of the Anzac Bridge, the incessant squawk of the ibises scavenging in the park, it all felt slightly off-key. I sat at my desk, the glow of my laptop painting my face blue. I opened a search engine. What do you type to find a word you can't remember? I tried, word for advisability. It gave me expediency, prudence, wisdom. I tried, verb for what you are supposed to do. It gave me must, ought, have to, need to. These were all close. They were synonyms, cousins, neighbors in the semantic space. But they weren't it. Ought was the closest, but it felt archaic, stuffy. The word I was looking for was common as dirt. You'd use it telling a child to look both ways before crossing the street. You'd use it when giving a friend advice. You'd use it on a medication label. Take 2 tablets with water. It is recommended that you not operate heavy machinery. The phrasing felt wrong. Stilted. Computer-generated. My heart started to pound, a frantic, trapped bird in my chest. This wasn't a brain fart anymore. This was something else. On a whim, I opened a digital archive of the Sydney Morning Herald from the 1980s. I started reading articles at random, scanning for the idea of the word, for the grammatical hole. I found it in a political opinion piece from 1985. The Premier's course of action, then, is clear. The ethical position demands he tender his resignation. The sentence screamed for the missing word. The Premier, damn it. The thought was there. The Premier, word, resign. It was so simple, so obvious. But it wasn't on the page. I scrolled through dozens of articles, from sports reports to film reviews. The same pattern emerged, clunky, awkward circumlocutions where a simple, elegant word used to be. My flat was on the 3rd floor. Below, Glebe Point Road was a river of late-night traffic. I watched a bus pull away from its stop, its diesel fumes ghosting in the humid air. I saw a couple arguing, their gestures sharp and angry. I saw a student cycling without a helmet. A thought surfaced, unbidden and clear, it is a good idea for him to wear a helmet. The sentence was an alien in my own mind. The rational part of my brain, the part that writes theses and pays rent, was screaming at me. Stress. Aphasia. You're having a minor neurological event. See a doctor. But another part of me, a deeper, more primal part, knew that wasn't it. This wasn't me breaking down. This was the world. I decided to run a test. A simple one. I walked to the all-night convenience store on the corner. The air outside was thick and smelled of rain and exhaust. A young man with tired eyes and a wispy beard was behind the counter, scrolling on his phone. I picked up a bottle of milk. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "The sign outside says you have a special on Tim Tams." "Yeah, 2 for $8. "Right. But is that a good deal? What was the price before?" He shrugged. "Dunno. $7 a pack, maybe. Up to you." "So, if I wanted to save money," I said, leaning forward slightly, my voice dropping, "the correct course of action is to buy the 2 packs. He gave me a weird look. "Dude, it's $1 off. If you want M, buy M." I felt a wave of dizziness. He didn't notice. He didn't see the gaping absurdity of my phrasing. I was speaking a warped, broken English, and he was answering me in kind. I pushed a $10 note across the counter. "It's important to get enough calcium," I said, tapping the milk bottle, trying one last time. My brain screamed the real sentence at me, word, get enough calcium. The clerk just nodded, his eyes already back on his phone. "Whatever you say, man." Walking back to my flat, the familiar streets of Glebe felt subtly alien. The Victorian terraces with their iron-lace balconies seemed to lean in, their windows like vacant eyes. The sandstone walls of a university, visible up the hill, looked less like a place of knowledge and more like a fortress, guarding something, or keeping something in. I got back to my apartment and locked the door, leaning against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The milk was cold in my hand. I stared at the label. Keep refrigerated. Consume within 5 days of opening. No friendly advice. No gentle recommendation. Just cold, hard imperatives. I felt the hole in my head again. It wasn't just a missing word anymore. It was a cavity. A void. And I had the terrifying, sinking feeling that it was growing. The world hadn't just forgotten a word. The world had forgotten the very concept the word described. And without that concept, things were beginning to fray. It was a quiet contagion, spreading through sentences, erasing a piece of our shared reality. And I was standing at the edge of the erasure, watching it happen. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The next few weeks were a descent into a private, quiet hell. The world kept turning, the sun kept rising over the harbor bridge, and people kept talking, their sentences looping around the void with a placid ignorance that was more terrifying than any panic. I became an obsessive collector of these linguistic oddities. My notebooks, once filled with neat diagrams of phonemes and syntax trees, were now chaotic catalogs of absence. Bus driver to passenger, it is a requirement that you tap on. Instead of, you, word, tap on. TV chef, for the best results, it is advisable to preheat your oven. Instead of, you, word, preheat your oven. Chloe, on the phone, about our mother's birthday, it would be a nice thing if we all got together for dinner. Instead of, we, word, all get together for dinner. Each instance was a small pinprick to my sanity. I was living in a world of passive constructions and clunky imperatives. The gentle, guiding hand of social expectation had vanished from the language, leaving only blunt commands or vague suggestions. The fabric of cooperation, of shared understanding, was being unpicked, thread by invisible thread. My isolation deepened. How do you explain to someone that a word is missing when you can't name the word? How do you point to a hole? My attempts were disastrous. I tried with Chloe again over coffee in Newtown. The cafe was buzzing, the air thick with the smell of roasting beans and sourdough toast. Chloe, listen to me, I began, my hands trembling so much I had to set my cup down. Something is wrong with the way people are talking. She stirred her latte, not looking at me. Here we go. Is this about your thesis again? You're overthinking. You always overthink. No, it's not overthinking. A word is gone. A really common word. She finally looked at me, her brow furrowed with a mixture of pity and exasperation. What word, Leo? I can't. I can't say it. But you used to use it. Everyone did. It's for when you give advice. When you say what the right thing to do is. Like, must? No, not that strong. Ought to. Closer, but no. It was smoother. More common. Leo, she said, her voice softening, the way it did when she was switching into her nurse persona. You're not making sense. You sound stressed. Are you sleeping? I'm not stressed, I'm observing. My voice was louder than I intended. A few people at the next table glanced over. Listen to yourself. You said, it would be a nice thing if we all got together. A few months ago, you would have said, we, word, get together. Don't you feel the gap? She just stared at me. The connection I'd hoped to make wasn't there. All she saw was her weird, academic brother spiraling. I think you need to take a break, she said softly. Maybe see Dr. Evans. I left the cafe feeling hollowed out, the chasm between me and the rest of the world wider than ever. They couldn't see it. They were living inside the distortion, their minds automatically papering over the cracks. I was the ghost, haunting the ruins of a language only I remembered. My last hope was Professor Finch. I cornered him after a lecture, my notebook clutched in my sweaty hand. I'd prepared my case like a legal argument, with dated examples and cross-references. "Professor," I began, "I have a hypothesis. I believe we're witnessing a real-time event of semantic extinction. A high-frequency modal verb has, it appears, vanished from the collective lexicon." Finch, who was packing his leather satchel, paused. He peered at me over the top of his spectacles, intrigued. "Go on, Mr. Maxwell. Which verb?" "The old, familiar wall." "That's the anomaly, Professor. I can't access the lexeme itself. But I can describe its function." I spent the next 10 minutes laying out my evidence, the awkward phrasing, the historical gaps, the way ought and must were being overextended to fill the void. He listened patiently, his head tilted. For a moment, a flicker of hope ignited in me. He was the one person on earth who might understand. "Fascinating," he said when I'd finished, his voice a low rumble. "A kind of linguistic phantom limb syndrome. But the explanation is likely far more mundane, I'm afraid. You're noticing a stylistic shift. Language is a living river, Mr. Maxwell, not a fixed crystal. We see it with the decline of the subjunctive mood. People say, 'if I was rich,' not 'if I were rich.' It's not that were has vanished, just that its usage has receded. Perhaps your missing word has simply fallen out of fashion." "This isn't fashion." "Professor," I insisted, my voice cracking. "This is an erasure. It's gone from books. From old recordings. It's been retroactively removed from reality." He frowned then, a genuine, deep-set frown of concern. "Leo. That is a very serious claim. It borders on the delusional." He put a hand on my shoulder. His touch felt heavy, dismissive. "You are one of my brightest students, but you are wound far too tight. I want you to take a fortnight off. No thesis, no archives. Walk along Coogee Beach. Clear your head. When you come back, we will speak of this no more. It is the best course of action." The best course of action. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. He had used the circumlocution. The contagion had him, too. His great, orderly mind had been quietly corrupted, and he was using its own flawed logic to diagnose me as insane. Defeated, I retreated to the last bastion of objective truth I could think of, the physical archives of the State Library. If the word had been erased digitally, perhaps, just perhaps, some ghost of it remained on paper, in ink. I spent days in the hushed, climate-controlled silence of the Special Collections Room, poring over century-old newspapers and first-edition novels, the dry, vanilla scent of old paper filling my lungs. I wasn't reading for content anymore. I was hunting for shadows, for sentences that felt incomplete. And as I did, my own secondary mystery began to surface. It was a glyph. A tiny, almost unnoticeable mark in the margins of the old books. It looked like a small, asymmetrical asterisk with a dot in the center, no bigger than a fleck of dust. At first, I dismissed it as a printer's error, a binder's mark, foxing. But the pattern was too consistent. I found it in a 1922 edition of a Miles Franklin novel. I found it in a government gazette from 1957. I found it in a street directory from 1988. It always appeared in the margin next to a line containing a clunky, repaired sentence, a sentence that screamed for the missing word. It was the scar. It was the mark left behind by the erasure. My obsession with the word became an obsession with the glyph. I photographed it with my phone, sketched it in my notebook, overlaying different instances to see if there was a pattern. The glyph wasn't just a mark, it was the physical evidence I needed. My search for the glyph led me to Alara. She was an archivist, a woman with pale, steady hands and eyes that seemed to hold the library's deep silence within them. She noticed my frantic, repetitive requests for seemingly unrelated materials. One afternoon, as I was hunched over a fragile, leather-bound volume with a magnifying glass, she approached my corral. "You're looking for the mark, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the air. I flinched, snapping the book shut. I don't know what you mean." She slid a piece of paper across the polished wood of the table. On it, she had drawn the glyph. Perfectly. "I've been seeing it for months," she said, her eyes fixed on my face. "I thought it was a new kind of paper mold. It's not in the catalog. It's not in any conservator's guide. It just appears." I ran a spectrographic analysis on one. The ink, or whatever it is, has no discernible chemical signature. It absorbs light completely. It's just a spot of nothing. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone. A surge of dizzying relief washed over me. I opened my notebook and showed her my collection of awkward sentences, my theory of the missing word. She listened, her expression unreadable. "A hole in the language," she murmured, tracing the glyph on the paper with her finger. "And this is the shape of the hole." Our alliance was forged in the quiet hum of the library's air conditioning. She provided the physical evidence, I provided the linguistic context. We worked in hushed tones, compiling a map of the contagion spread through the library's collection. It was appearing in newer books now, not just old ones. A cookbook from 2018. A collection of contemporary poetry published last year. The erasure was ongoing. It was accelerating. But as we worked, a subtle change came over Elara. Her initial scientific curiosity began to morph into something else. She became less interested in the why and more fascinated by the glyph itself. She would stare at the photographs for long periods, her focus absolute. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said one evening, holding a magnified image up to the light. "So perfect. So complete in its absence." Her speech started to change, too. She began using the same stilted constructions as everyone else, not with the awkwardness of a recent convert, but with a strange, fluid grace, as if it were the most natural way to speak. The breaking point came when I found a fresh glyph in a book we had both handled a week prior. It hadn't been there before. "Elara, it's spreading," I said, my voice tight with panic. "It's happening now. We have to." "We have to what, Leo?" she asked, not looking up from her sketch of the glyph. "What is the indicated response?" "There is no response. There is only the pattern. Don't you see? It's affecting you. You're starting to sound like them." She finally looked at me, and her eyes were calm, placid, empty. The ally I thought I had found was gone. She was just another vessel for the quiet. "It is a good idea to accept the change, Leo," she said, her voice a soothing, terrifying whisper. "It is so much more peaceful." I backed away from the table, from her, from the library that had been my only sanctuary. She didn't try to stop me. She just returned to her drawing, her pen tracing the shape of nothing, over and over again. I was alone again, but this time it was worse. I had seen the other side. The contagion didn't just make you forget, it offered a kind of peace in return. The peace of utter emptiness. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Leaving the library, I stumbled out into the twilight of Macquarie Street. The grand sandstone buildings of the city, the hospital, the parliament, seemed like mausoleums. The sky was a bruised purple, and the first city lights were beginning to glitter, cold and indifferent. Elara's placid smile was burned into my mind. The contagion wasn't just an absence, it was a presence. A silent, seductive conversion. My apartment felt less like a home and more like a cell. I paced the small living room, the city's hum a constant, nagging pressure against the windows. What was I fighting? A virus? A mass delusion? A side effect of some new technology beaming signals into our brains? My linguistic training was useless. This wasn't about language anymore. Language was just the first symptom, the canary in the cognitive coal mine. I took out my notebook, my hands shaking. I had the glyphs Alara and I had mapped. Dozens of them, from books scattered across the library. There had to be a logic to it. I pinned the photocopies to my wall, connecting them with string like some madman in a detective film. I had dates, locations of publication, library shelf numbers. Nothing. It was random. Then a new thought struck me. It wasn't about the book's origins. It was about their locations within the library. I pulled up a schematic of the state library's collection floors. I started plotting the locations of the books where we'd found the glyphs. Mitchell Wing, shelf C4. Macquarie Wing, level 3, shelf A12. The points were scattered. But when I overlaid it with a map of Sydney's CBD, a faint pattern began to emerge. A ghostly echo. It wasn't perfect, but there was a loose correlation between the glyphs' locations in the library and the paths of the City Circle train line. It was insane. A correlation built on 3 layers of abstraction. But it was the only lead I had. The effects of the missing word were becoming more tangible now, seeping into the very mechanics of the city. It was a subtle decay of civic grace. People didn't queue properly at the bus stop anymore, they just formed a restless clump. Drivers didn't give way as often, not with aggression, but with a kind of baffled inertia, as if the concept of yielding was a complex equation they couldn't be bothered to solve. Conversations were becoming more transactional, stripped of the nuances of politeness. The social lubrication provided by that one simple word was gone, and the gears of society were beginning to grind. I witnessed it firsthand one afternoon at Circular Quay. A tourist, flustered and lost, was trying to ask a transport official for directions to the Taronah Zoo ferry. "Which wharf is correct for the zoo?" the tourist asked. The official, a woman in a bright blue uniform, simply pointed a lazy finger. "That one." She didn't say, "You should go to wharf 2." She didn't even say, "It is advisable to use that wharf." She just pointed. The tourist, needing more reassurance, hesitated. The official just stared back, her expression not hostile, just blank, as if the request for further clarification was a language she no longer spoke. The interaction failed. The tourist wandered off, more confused than before. It was a small thing, but I saw it for what it was, a breakdown in the code of mutual assistance. Without the language of obligation, the obligation itself was thinning out. Fueled by a new, desperate energy, I decided to follow my insane train line theory. I spent the next few days riding the City Circle loop, over and over again. From Central to Town Hall, Wynyard, Circular Quay, St. James, Museum, and back again. I sat on the train, watching people. They stared at their phones, listened to music, or just gazed into the middle distance with a profound, unsettling vacancy. Their faces were placid masks. I started to get off at each station, walking the platforms, the tunnels. The air underground was cool and smelled of ozone, hot metal, and damp concrete. The roar of arriving and departing trains was a physical force. In the tiled passageways, the endless river of commuters flowed around me. But I was looking for something else. I was looking for the glyph. At first, I found nothing. The walls were a mess of grime, peeling posters, and legitimate maintenance markings. I felt my hope, and my sanity, dwindling. Chloe had called twice, her messages shifting from worried to angry. Professor Finch had sent an email officially putting my candidature on hold. I was completely untethered. It was at Wynyard Station, in a little-used pedestrian tunnel connecting to the Hunter Connection, that I saw it. It wasn't a small mark in a margin. It was a faint, shimmering distortion in the air itself, hovering over a large, complex tangle of graffiti on the wall. It was almost invisible, like a heat haze on a winter's day. I approached it slowly. As I got closer, I could see the graffiti beneath it wasn't random spray paint. It was a dense, overlapping network of thousands upon thousands of tiny, scratched glyphs. Some were faded, others looked fresh. It was a nest. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a scar, it was a colony. A place where the thing was growing. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, and collided with someone. I spun around, ready to apologize, and found myself face to face with a transit police officer. He was a big man, his face weathered and tired. "Everything all right here, mate?" he asked, his voice a low Sydney drawl. "Fine, officer." "Just, looking at the art," I stammered, gesturing vaguely at the wall. His eyes followed my gesture, but there was no spark of suspicion in them. Only a placid dullness. "Yeah, right. Art. Just move along, eh? It's not a good idea to loiter in the tunnels. It's not a good idea." The contagion was everywhere. It was in the language of authority, the very people tasked with maintaining order. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same emptiness I'd seen in Alara's eyes. He wasn't a threat. He was just a shell, his behavior governed by a stripped-down, simplified set of rules. My theory evolved. This thing, this entity, or force, wasn't just eating concepts. It was simplifying them. It was sanding down the complex, messy edges of human interaction, obligation, propriety, nuance, and replacing them with a streamlined, binary logic. Do. Don't do. The world was being downgraded to a more primitive operating system. The stakes had escalated beyond my own sanity. This wasn't just about a missing word anymore. It was about the slow, quiet, systematic dismantling of the software that ran human society. The horror wasn't that the world was ending in fire and chaos, but that it was ending in a calm, orderly, thoughtless regression. I had to find the source. The central node. The heart of the network. My map, my crazy train line theory, pointed to one place. The oldest, deepest, and most complex part of the network. The dark, sprawling labyrinth beneath Central Station. I bought a powerful torch and a bottle of water. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there. There was no one to call, no authority to warn. They were all part of the problem. My quest had become a purely personal one. I wasn't trying to save the world anymore. I was just trying to understand what was devouring it. I needed to look into the face of the void, even if it devoured me too. That night, I descended into the belly of the beast. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The public levels of Central Station were a familiar cathedral of controlled chaos, the grand concourse with its soaring clock, the departure boards clicking over, the tide of travelers pulling suitcases. But I was heading deeper. I found an unattended service door near the ghost platforms, 14 and 15, and slipped through. The air changed instantly. The noise of the station muted to a distant rumble, replaced by the drip of water and the low, resonant hum of vast machinery. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the sharp, bouncing beam of my torch. I was in the station's undercroft, a maze of forgotten tunnels and maintenance shafts that threaded through the city's sandstone bedrock. My theory had been a flimsy thing of string and hope, but down here, it felt terrifyingly real. I followed the path my map had suggested, a route that shadowed the tangled convergence of the train lines far above. The glyphs were here. Not faint marks in the air, but etched into the damp brickwork, glowing with a faint, internal luminescence, like phosphorescent moss. They pulsed slowly, in time with the deep hum that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I walked for what felt like hours, deeper into the oppressive silence. The tunnel opened into a vast, vaulted chamber, a cavern carved by man and time. In the center of the cavern, it hung. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't a machine. It was a nexus of pure absence. A glyph, the size of a car, woven from shimmering, shifting threads of absolute black. It didn't reflect my torchlight, it swallowed it. It was a hole in reality, and the air around it vibrated with a silent, hypnotic frequency. And there were people. Dozens of them, standing in loose, concentric circles around the central void. They were from all walks of life, a woman in a business suit, a man in a courier's uniform, a young kid with a skateboard. And, standing near the front, his back to me, was a man in a rumpled tweed jacket. Professor Finch. They were all staring at the glyph, their faces utterly placid, their eyes unfocused. They weren't entranced like zombies, they were, attending. Their lips moved faintly, but no sounds emerged. They were feeding it. Offering up their thoughts, their concepts, their words. Finch, my mentor, was giving away his life's work, his cathedral of etymology, pouring it into the silent, hungry void. I saw his shoulders slump slightly, a lifetime of knowledge draining away, leaving behind a peaceful, hollow shell. This was the confrontation. Not a battle, but a quiet, terrible sermon. I finally understood. The thing wasn't malicious. Malice is a complex concept, a product of intent and morality. This thing was simpler. It was a force of nature from a different kind of nature. A conceptual fungus. An informational slime mold. It had bled through into our reality and found a rich, untapped food source, human abstract thought. It consumed the complex, messy, inefficient concepts first. Obligation. Propriety. Nuance. The word that had slipped away wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. My presence had not gone unnoticed. A few of the figures turned their heads slowly, their blank eyes fixing on me. They didn't move to attack. They simply looked, and in their gaze was an invitation. An offer of peace. Stop fighting. Stop thinking so hard. Let go. It is a good idea to join us. It is the correct course of action. The silent pull was immense. My own mind felt frayed, exhausted. The hole where the word used to be was aching, a hollow pain in my very consciousness. It would be so easy to step forward, to let the noise and the fear and the loneliness drain away, to become a calm, silent part of the pattern. To finally be at peace. My torchlight flickered on Professor Finch's face as he turned slightly. For a second, just a flicker, I saw a trace of the man he had been, a glint of intellectual fire in his eyes, a twitch of confusion. A ghost in the machine. And then it was gone, subsumed by the placid emptiness. That flicker saved me. It wasn't peace they had. It was erasure. I chose to run. I turned and scrambled back through the tunnels, the hum of the void chasing me. I didn't stop until I burst back through the service door into the noise and light of the station concourse. The world I re-entered felt garish, loud, and brutally complex. And I had never been so grateful for it. I pushed through the crowds, got on the first train heading out of the city, and didn't look back. That was 6 months ago. I live in a small town in the Blue Mountains now. The air is clean, and the silence is made of wind in the eucalyptus trees, not a creeping void. I rent a small cabin and work a cash-in-hand job at a local nursery. I don't talk to people much. I write everything down. I fill notebooks, not with theories, but with memories. I write down words, complex sentences, idioms, snippets of poetry, philosophical arguments. I am trying to build a sea wall against the encroaching tide. But I know it's a losing battle. The contagion wasn't just in Sydney. It's in the air. It's in the internet. It's in the very structure of human language. I hear it sometimes, in the speech of the townspeople. A little less nuance. A little more bluntness. And other words are starting to fray at the edges for me. Last week, I was trying to describe the feeling of watching a storm roll in over the escarpment, and I couldn't find the word for it. Not awe. Not fear. Something in between. A word for sublime, beautiful terror. I can feel the shape of it. A hole. Smaller than the last one, but it's there. I can't tell you the first word that slipped away. Soon, I might not be able to tell you about the second, or the third. I am a keeper of fading memories, an archivist of a world that is quietly, peacefully, forgetting itself. The quiet contagion is patient. And it is winning. All I can do is keep writing, until the day I pick up my pen and can no longer remember the word for hope. The chair on floor 6. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life was a geography of straight lines. The tram tracks that sliced through the Manchester drizzle every morning, the Cat6 cables I unspooled and terminated with a satisfying click, the neat, indented rows of code I'd scroll through to find a single misplaced semicolon. I was Leo Wallace, an IT technician for Cognisys Solutions, and my job was to impose digital order on the analog chaos of 300 employees. I was good at it because I understood systems. I understood that if A, then B, cause, then effect. Cromwell Tower, where Cognisys occupied floors 4 through 9, was a system in itself. A vertical stack of anxieties and ambitions, all humming along to the tune of its central HVAC. I knew its digital nervous system better than I knew my own. I knew that the marketing department on 7 pulled the most bandwidth streaming video, and that the account server on 5 ran a batch process at 2:17 a.m. that always caused a fractional, system-wide lag. I knew its rhythms. The first deviation, the first note of discord, arrived as a ticket in my queue. TCKT number 77341, Wi-Fi weak in conference room 6F. Unable to hold stable connection for video call. I frowned. Conference room 6F. I'd been at Cognisys for 3 years. I'd installed access points on every floor. We had 6A through 6E, a row of glass-walled cubes of varying sizes. I'd never heard of 6F. Probably a recent designation for some forgotten corner office. I grabbed my tablet and a signal tester and took the lift to the 6th floor. It was the quietest floor, home to legal and internal audit, departments that ran on paper and suspicion. I walked past the familiar glass fronts of 6A, 6E. At the end of the hall, where I always thought there was just a blank wall before the fire escape, was a solid, dark wood door. No glass panel. No room number plaque, just a small, tarnished brass 6F screwed into the wood. It looked ancient compared to the brushed aluminium and frosted glass aesthetic of the rest of the floor. I pushed the door. It swung open silently on well-oiled hinges. The room was small, maybe big enough for 6 people. No vast mahogany table, no projector screen. Just a threadbare, grayish carpet, walls painted a shade of indeterminate beige, and a single window looking out over the perpetual gray of the Manchester skyline. And in the center of the room, a chair. It was a wingback, upholstered in cracked brown leather, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a dusty university library or a grandfather's study. It was completely at odds with the sterile functionality of everything else in the building. Sitting in it was Sarah from accounts. She was a woman who seemed to operate at a baseline level of frazzled panic, her desk a testament to entropy. But now, she was perfectly still, her hands resting on the worn leather arms of the chair, her gaze fixed on the window but not, I suspected, on the view. She looked serene. Utterly, unervingly calm. "Sarah?" I said, my voice sounding loud in the quiet. Her head turned slowly. Her eyes were placid. "Oh. Leo. Hello. Got a ticket about the Wi-Fi in here," I said, holding up my tablet. She gave a slow, beatific smile. "Ah. Yes. We were trying to have a call. It kept dropping." "Right. I'll just run a quick scan." I walked the perimeter of the room with my signal tester. The signal was fine. Full bars. I checked for interference from the surrounding rooms, from the floor above, from the floor below. Nothing. The network was performing flawlessly. "Looks fine from my end," I said. "No issues at all." "Oh, don't worry about it," she said, her voice soft, dismissive. "It's not important." She turned her head back to the window. Her posture, the stillness of her, was absolute. "Okay," I said, backing out of the room. "I'll just close the ticket then." She didn't answer. As I pulled the door shut, I could see her silhouette against the gray light, a motionless figure in an out-of-place chair. I put it down to stress. Sarah was probably just hiding from her workload in the only room in the building no one ever seemed to use. I closed the ticket and forgot about it. A week later, I saw Mark from sales coming out of 6F. Mark was a human exclamation mark, a man who spoke in motivational quotes and lived on a diet of caffeine and commission. He moved with a kind of kinetic desperation. But as he closed the door to 6F behind him, he was walking slowly, deliberately. His face, usually flushed and taut, was smooth. "All right, Mark?" I asked as we passed in the corridor. He stopped and looked at me, really looked at me, which was a novelty. Usually, he looked past you, for the next opportunity. "Never better, Leo. Never better." Just, soaking up the quiet. He patted my shoulder with a strange, gentle pressure and walked away, his usual Tasmanian devil energy replaced by a sort of glacial calm. The change was so pronounced it was like seeing a photograph of a hurricane printed in pastel colors. The whispers started after that. Little comments dropped by the coffee machine or in the lift. "Deadlines are killing me. Think I need a session in the chair. 10 minutes in 6F. Better than a week in the Canaries." It was my work friend, Chloe, who finally pushed it from curiosity to concern. We were grabbing a hurried lunch in the basement canteen. She was a graphic designer, perpetually wrestling with impossible demands from marketing. "They want a full rebrand concept by Friday," she sighed, stabbing at her salad. "My brain feels like a bag of angry cats." "Standard," I commiserated. "I'm going to have to pull a late one. I'll need the chair." I stopped chewing. "The one in 6F. Her eyes lit up with a convert's zeal. "You've been. Isn't it incredible? It's like, you know, the hum. The constant background noise of the building, the traffic, the air conditioning, people talking. When you sit in that chair, it all just stops. Not like it's soundproofed. It's deeper. It's like you can hear the silence underneath it all." "The silence underneath it all," I repeated, the phrase landing strangely in my ear. "It just clears your head. You should try it, Leo. Seriously." She looked at me, her expression earnest and open, but with that same placid quality I'd seen in Sarah and Mark. A settledness. An absence of static. My own life wasn't exactly a portrait of inner peace. I lived alone in a small flat in Ancoats, my evenings a predictable cycle of takeaway, streaming services, and the low-grade hum of loneliness. The quiet Chloe described sounded appealing. Too appealing. That evening, I couldn't shake it. The idea of a room that could just turn off the noise. It gnawed at me. My server migration project was looming, a complex beast of a task that involved shifting the company's entire digital lifeblood to a new set of machines in the dead of night. My brain was already buzzing with potential points of failure, a static of its own. Against my better judgment, I took the lift back up to the 6th floor at 7 p.m. The floor was deserted, bathed in the cold, bluish light of the emergency fixtures. The door to 6F was slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness in the artificially lit hallway. I pushed it open. The room was empty. The chair sat in the center, a silent invitation. It looked heavier in the gloom, its cracked leather absorbing the faint light. The air in the room felt different. Cooler, denser. My heart was beating a little too fast. "This is ridiculous," I told myself. "It's a bloody chair." I walked in, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. I shut the door behind me, and the click of the latch was loud, final. The room was plunged into near total darkness, save for the faint urban glow from the window. I sat in the chair. The leather was cool and smooth. The wings of the chair curved around my head, creating a little world of their own. For a moment, nothing happened. I could still hear the distant rumble of a tram on Mosley Street, the faint whir of a PC fan from the main office floor. And then, it began. It wasn't a sound fading. It was a frequency shifting. The hum of the building, the white noise I was so accustomed to I didn't even notice it anymore, didn't disappear. It was cancelled out. It was as if a perfectly inverted waveform was being projected, nullifying the background chatter of existence. The tram rumble, the fan whir, the very thrum of electricity in the walls, they weren't gone, but they were rendered irrelevant, like shouts swallowed by a vacuum. What was left was not silence. Chloe was right. It was something else. A hush. A deep, resonant quiet that had a presence, a texture. It felt ancient and profound. My anxieties about the server migration, my vague sadness about my empty flat, the constant, churning narrator in my own head, they all just stopped. My thoughts didn't race, they floated, serene and detached. I sat there for what felt like 5 minutes. When my phone buzzed in my pocket, the vibration was a violent intrusion, a seismic shock. I jolted, my heart hammering. I pulled it out. I had been in the chair for 47 minutes. I stood up, my legs unsteady. The everyday sounds of the building rushed back in, but now they sounded harsh, abrasive, a cacophony of meaningless noise. I felt an almost physical sense of loss. I stumbled out of the room, closing the door behind me with a reverent quiet. Walking back to the lift, I felt clear-headed, refreshed, and more deeply terrified than I had ever been in my life. A system that behaved like this wasn't a system I understood. And a chair that could do that wasn't a chair. It was an anomaly. And it was spreading. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The hush lingered. Not in my ears, but in my memory. A phantom limb of perfect quiet. In the days that followed, the world felt too loud, too chaotic. The clatter of keyboards, the banal chatter in the kitchen, the very air itself seemed thick with irritating noise. I found myself craving the clean, empty peace of room 6F. I understood the addiction. That was the most frightening part. I started watching. Not just casually noticing, but actively observing. There was a rhythm to it, an unspoken social contract. No one ever seemed to be waiting for the room. No one complained it was occupied. People just knew when it was their turn. They would get up from their desks, their faces tight with stress or boredom, and walk towards the 6th floor. They would return 20, 30, 60 minutes later, their expressions smoothed over, their movements efficient and calm. They were more productive, yes, but in the way a machine is productive. The frantic, human edge was gone. They were becoming more like the system, and less like the people operating it. The chair had its regulars, Sarah from accounts, Mark from sales, a dozen others. But new acolytes were joining the silent congregation every day. A paralegal who'd always been a bundle of nerves. A junior programmer who used to chew his fingernails to the quick. Now they all shared the same placid gaze, the same unhurried gait. My isolation began when I tried to voice my concerns. I caught Chloe by her desk, showing her a network diagram for the new server rack. Speaking of the 6th floor, I began, trying to sound casual, that room 6F is getting popular. It's a good space, she said, her eyes not leaving her monitor. Good for focus. It's weird, though, isn't it? An old room like that. And that chair. She finally looked at me, and her friendly face was a mask of polite incomprehension. It's just a chair, Leo. A comfortable one. You're overthinking it. But the way people are, don't you find it a bit strange? People are less stressed, she said, a hint of something cool in her tone. I'd have thought that was a good thing. She turned back to her work, a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. It was like trying to describe color to someone who only sees in grayscale. They didn't lack the words, they lacked the entire frame of reference for my anxiety. To them, the chair was a benefit, a feature of the office. To me, it was a bug in the code of reality. The rational IT technician in me needed data. I decided to investigate the room itself. It wasn't on the fire escape plans posted in the hallways. I checked the online booking system for conference rooms. 6A, E were there, but 6F was absent. It was a ghost. My admin privileges were my skeleton key to Cromwell Tower's digital soul. Late one night, feigning work on the migration project, I delved into the building management servers. I found the directory for the original architectural and engineering blueprints, files that hadn't been touched in years. I clicked open the PDF for the 6th floor layout. My blood went cold. I stared at the screen, zooming in, then out, then in again. The architectural drawing was precise. It showed the lift lobby, the corridor, the row of conference rooms 6A through 6E. And where 6F should have been, there was a large, solid gray box, cross-hatched and labeled, structural core/utility shaft. According to the people who built this tower, the people who understood its bones of concrete and steel, room 6F did not exist. It could not exist. It occupied a space that was supposed to be filled with rebar, elevator cables, and electrical conduits. A wave of vertigo washed over me. I felt untethered, the solid ground of my logical world crumbling away. The chair wasn't just weird. The room itself was an impossibility. This discovery propelled me into a state of low-grade, simmering paranoia. My server migration project became my cover. It gave me a legitimate reason to be prowling the building at all hours, to be looking at network traffic, to be poking into the digital guts of the tower. And that's when I found the secondary mystery. The subplot written in lines of code. Every network switch in the building logs its traffic. Mostly, it's boring stuff, data packets flowing to and from the internet, to the servers, between workstations. But the switch on the 6th floor, the one closest to the impossible room, had an anomaly. Every time my own observations told me someone was likely in 6F, a strange burst of data occurred. It wasn't a lot, just a few kilobytes. And it wasn't going to the internet or to our servers. It was being sent to a single, internal IP address that didn't officially exist. It wasn't assigned to any printer, PC, or server. It was a ghost address on a ghost network. The packets were encrypted, their contents gibberish to me. But their timing was undeniable. The room, or the chair, or the person in it, was communicating. Or something was communicating through them. I was in over my head. The blueprints were one thing, this was another. This was active, happening now, a quiet contagion spreading not just through the minds of my colleagues, but through the very network I was paid to maintain. I needed help. Not from a manager who would tell me to get back to work, or a colleague who would smile placidly and offer me a seat in the chair. I needed someone who understood the building as a physical object, not just a corporate space. Priya Sharma. Priya was the assistant facilities manager, a woman in her late 40s with shrewd eyes and hands that always seemed to have a light dusting of plaster or grease on them. She operated out of a cluttered office in the sub-basement, surrounded by rolls of blueprints, spare parts, and the faint smell of industrial solvent. She had a cynical, no-nonsense view of the world and a deep, abiding distrust of the white-collar cowboys on the upper floors. She knew every pipe, every duct, every secret of Cromwell Tower. I found her wrestling with a jammed keycard reader. "Priya," I started. "If you're here to tell me the Wi-Fi's down, it's a solar flare, I can't do anything about it," she said without looking up. "It's not about the Wi-Fi. It's about the 6th floor. Let me guess. Leaky ceiling tile and legal. Henderson's complaining his office is 2 degrees too cold again." "It's about a room," I said, lowering my voice. Conference room 6F. She finally stopped and looked at me, wiping her hands on a rag. The little spooky one at the end of the hall. What about it? You know it? Know it? Of course I know it. Can't get a key for it. Door's been there as long as I have. We just leave it be. Assumed it was some kind of executive bolt hole from the old days. Priya, it's not on the blueprints. She snorted. Nothing in this building is where the blueprints say it is. They changed the layout on 8 3 times without telling anyone. No, I mean the original architectural plans. The ones from the build. That space is a solid concrete core. That got her attention. She straightened up, her cynical mask cracking to show a flicker of genuine curiosity. Show me. I pulled up the PDF on my tablet. She leaned in, her eyes tracing the lines, her breath fogging the screen slightly. Well, I'll be damned, she whispered, tapping the cross-hatched square. It can't exist. But it does, I said. And something's happening in there. People are changing. Priya was quiet for a long moment, looking from the tablet to my face. I expected her to laugh, to tell me I was crazy. Instead, she just nodded slowly. This building's got history, Leo, she said, her voice low. Weird drafts, cold spots, stories from the night security about footsteps on empty floors. But a whole room that shouldn't be there, that's new. She looked back at the blueprint. The hard copies are in the archive. The originals. Let's see what they say. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't entirely alone. But as we descended into the dusty, silent depths of the tower, I had the chilling feeling that we weren't seeking a solution, but merely a better definition of the problem. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The sub-basement archive was a tomb of forgotten corporate history. Racks of bankers' boxes slumped under the weight of time. And the air was thick with the smell of decaying paper and dust. Priya located a large metal cabinet, unlocked it with a key that looked medieval, and pulled open a drawer with a screech of protesting metal. Inside were long, tightly rolled scrolls of heavy paper. The original blueprints. We spread the one for the 6th floor across a large, dusty table. It was a beautiful, hand-drawn document, a work of art from a time before CAD software. And there it was, rendered in precise, confident ink, the structural core, a solid, inviolable block at the end of the hall. There was no door. No room. No 6F. It's not an unrecorded renovation, Priya murmured, running a finger along the edge of the core's outline. To put a room there, you'd have to compromise the building's main support. You'd have to be a madman. She straightened up, new, deeper unease on her face. So what the hell is it? We stood in the silence of the basement, the impossible fact of the room hanging between us. What was here before the tower? I asked. Priya's gaze became distant. My granddad worked demolition in the 70s. Helped clear this plot. He used to say it was bad ground. Before the old mill they tore down, there was a Victorian workhouse. And before that, some kind of private sanatorium for the mentally afflicted. She looked at me, her eyes dark. Places with a lot of quiet desperation, he called them. A shiver traced its way down my spine. The hush beneath all the noise. Back in the bright, artificial world of the upper floors, the change was accelerating. The sitters, as I'd started calling them, were no longer just individuals seeking solace. They were becoming a collective. I saw it in the subtle, synchronized way they'd all pause their typing at the same moment. In the shared, knowing glances they'd exchange across the open-plan office. They didn't need to talk about the chair anymore, the understanding was implicit, a silent protocol running in the background of their consciousness. The atmosphere on the affected floors was changing. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a calm, focused productivity that was deeply unnerving. Deadlines were met without complaint. Difficult clients were handled with unflappable patience. From a management perspective, Cognisis was running better than ever. But the humanity was being bled out of it, one 30-minute session at a time. Laughter was rare. Arguments were non-existent. The place was becoming a library of ghosts. Then came the escalation. One afternoon, I had to replace a faulty network port near the end of the 6th-floor corridor. As I knelt, plugging in my tester, I was aware of the door to 6F. It had been closed all day. On impulse, I finished my work and walked over, trying the handle. It was locked. This was new. It had never been locked before. As my fingers left the handle, a man I'd never seen before stepped out of the adjacent stairwell. He wasn't an employee, he wore a simple, nondescript gray shirt and trousers. But his face had the same look. That preternatural calm, that vacant serenity. He didn't speak. He just stood there, about 10 feet away, watching me. His stillness was a physical barrier, his gaze a clear, silent warning. This is not for you. I felt a prickle of primal fear. I gave a tight nod and walked away, his eyes on my back until I turned the corner. The anomaly was no longer passive. It was protecting itself. My own obsession deepened. The network packets from the 6th-floor switch were growing in size and frequency. I spent 2 sleepless nights writing a script to capture and analyze one of these ghost transmissions. When I finally succeeded, the result was more baffling than I could have imagined. I stared at the data, rendered visually on my screen. It wasn't code. It wasn't text. It was a complex, looping waveform, intricate and impossibly detailed. It looked almost biological, like a digital representation of a human brainwave scan, or perhaps a sound wave for a frequency far beyond the range of human hearing. It was the digital signature of the hush. It wasn't just an experience people were having, it was a piece of information, a payload being delivered and propagated through the building's nervous system. The chair wasn't a refuge, it was a terminal. I had to show Priya. I found her in her basement office, looking tired. I explained what I'd found, the locked door, the silent sentinel, the data packets. I showed her the waveform on my laptop. She stared at it, her face pale. "Leo," she said, her voice strained. "We need to stop. Stop. Priya, this thing is spreading. It's rewriting people." "And what are we going to do?" she shot back, her voice a harsh whisper. "Call the police." "Excuse me, officer, there's a spooky chair in a room that doesn't exist and it's making my coworkers calm and efficient. They'd commit us both. So we just let it happen." "Look at them," she said, her voice softening with a weary resignation that chilled me to the bone. "Are they in pain? Are they hurting anyone? Sarah from accounts hasn't had a panic attack in 2 months. Mark from sales is actually tolerable. People seem happier. Quieter. Maybe it's better this way." I stared at her, aghast. "That's not happiness, Priya. It's erasure. It's a whitewash over their personalities. It's taking everything that makes them, them. Maybe them was just a collection of anxieties and bad habits," she said, turning away from me. "Maybe this is an upgrade." The word hit me like a punch. An upgrade. She was starting to think like them. I don't know if she'd sat in the chair, or if the building's pervasive influence was just seeping into her, but I had lost her. The logic of the hush was seductive. Peace is better than turmoil, silence is better than noise. She had chosen the comfortable lie. I left her office, the weight of my isolation pressing down on me more heavily than ever. I was the last sane man, the final glitch in a system that was relentlessly debugging itself. The server migration was scheduled for Saturday night. It was my project. My responsibility. It would grant me complete, unfettered access to the entire building, to every network switch, for 12 hours. As I walked through the quiet evening office, past the placid faces of my colleagues packing up for the weekend, a desperate, terrible idea began to form in my mind. I couldn't fight the people. I couldn't reason with the phenomenon. But the network was my domain. The anomaly had made the mistake of touching my world, the world of straight lines and logical rules. I was going to sever the connection. I was going to go into the heart of the system and cut the wire. And if I had to, I would confront the chair itself. It was a foolish plan, born of desperation. But it was the only plan I had. I was going to war with a ghost, and my only weapon was a pair of cable snips. Phase 4, Confrontation and Aftermath. Saturday. 9 p.m. Cromwell Tower was a silent monolith against the bruised purple of the night sky. The official migration window was open. I had the building to myself. Or so I thought. I signed in with the lone security guard, a cheerful old chap named Alfie who was more interested in his crossword puzzle than my presence. I took the lift not to the server room in the basement, but to the 6th floor. The silence in the lift was different from the hush. It was just an absence of noise, thin and empty. The lift doors opened onto darkness. The main office lights were off, the floor lit only by the green glow of fire exit signs and the scattered pixels of sleeping monitors. But it wasn't empty. My breath caught in my chest. Dotted around the large, open-plan space were figures. At least a dozen of them. Standing silently in the dark. Some stood by desks, some by windows, but they were all facing the same direction, towards the corridor that led to room 6F. They were the sitters. Sarah, Mark, Chloe, and others I recognized. They weren't moving. They weren't speaking. They were sentinels. Guardians. Their collective presence was a psychic wall, an atmosphere of immense, silent pressure. My plan had been to sneak to the network closet, disable the port that served the impossible room, and then, if I was brave enough, deal with the chair. But there was no sneaking past this. I took a step out of the lift. None of them turned. None of them moved to block me. But I felt their awareness of me, a unified, dispassionate attention. It was more terrifying than any physical threat. They knew why I was here. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, analog drumbeat in a world of digital calm. I forced myself to walk, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. I walked past Mark, who stood ramrod straight, his gaze fixed. I walked past Sarah, her hands clasped in front of her as if in prayer. As I passed Chloe, her head turned almost imperceptibly in my direction. There was no recognition in her eyes. Only a deep, calm certainty. I reached the corridor. The door to 6F was at the far end, a rectangle of deeper blackness. It was ajar. An invitation. I knew then that they weren't here to stop me. They were here to bear witness. I walked down the hall. With each step, the ambient noise of the city outside seemed to fade, the air growing thick and still. The hush was leaking out, bleeding into the corridor. By the time I reached the door, the world beyond it had fallen away completely. I was at the edge of its event horizon. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The force of the quiet was staggering. It was a physical pressure, a gravity well that pulled at my thoughts, my memories, my very sense of self. It wanted to smooth me out, to erase the frantic, messy scribbles of my identity and leave a clean, blank page. In the center of the room, the chair sat, looking less like a piece of furniture and more like a feature of the geology, something that had pushed its way up from the bedrock of reality. It was darker than I remembered, the leather seeming to drink the faint light from the window. The urge to sit, to give in, to finally be quiet, was immense. It was a siren song for the tired and the anxious, and I was so tired. But my anger, my fear, my stubborn, illogical refusal to be deleted, was stronger. I came here to do a job. I looked at the wall behind the chair, the wall that shouldn't exist. Where would the network cable be? There were no faceplates, no sockets. On a desperate impulse, I reached out and touched the wall. My fingers met not with plasterboard or concrete, but with something else. It was cold, yielding, like dense, damp clay. It held the impression of my fingers for a second before smoothing over. A low, resonant thrum vibrated through my bones, not a sound but a feeling. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The room wasn't in the building. The room was wearing the building. This wasn't a renovation, it was an intrusion, a cyst of some other place that had grown into a void in our world. The building had simply formed around it, accommodating the impossible geometry like a pearl forming around a grain of sand. The chair, the walls, the hush, they were all one thing. A non-Euclidean tumor in the heart of Cromwell Tower. The network packets weren't a communication. They were a replication, the anomaly using our own systems to reinforce its existence, to copy and paste its fundamental wrongness into the digital ether. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I couldn't cut a wire. How do you unplug a ghost? Then, the doorway darkened. One by one, the sitters began to file into the room. They moved with a slow, graceful purpose, arranging themselves in a silent semicircle around me and the chair. They weren't threatening. Their faces held no malice. They were full of a serene, unnerving pity. They were a welcome party. Chloe stepped forward. She looked at me, and for a fleeting instant, I saw a flicker of the old Chloe, the friend I'd had lunch with. A flicker of conflict, of sorrow. Then it was gone, submerged beneath the placid calm. She raised a hand and gestured, gently, towards the wingback chair. The invitation was clear. Join us. Sit down. The struggle is over. Let the noise stop. I looked at the chair, the nexus of the quiet contagion. I looked at the faces of my coworkers, peaceful and empty. I thought of my frantic, messy life, the loneliness, the anxiety, the constant, grinding noise of being human. The hush promised an end to all of it. A perfect, final silence. But it was their silence, not mine. I took a deep breath, the air thick with an alien stillness. No, I whispered, the word feeling like a rock thrown into a placid lake. I turned and walked towards the door. The semicircle of sitters parted before me, a silent, fluid movement. They did not try to stop me. They just watched me go, their calm eyes following me as I fled back into the world of noise and chaos. I didn't run from the building. I walked, deliberately, back to the server room in the basement. My hands were shaking, but my mind was cold and clear. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't destroy it. I couldn't remove it. But I could contain it. I worked through the night, not on the server migration I was supposed to be doing, but on something else. I used my admin access to build a firewall. A digital quarantine. I isolated the entire 6th floor network, rerouting its traffic into a black hole, a closed loop that led nowhere. I created rules so complex and buried so deep in the system's core architecture that no one but me would ever be able to find or undo them. I cut off the anomaly's access to its digital amplifier. I couldn't excise the tumor, but I could stop it from metastasizing through the network. When I was done, the sun was rising. I left Cromwell Tower and didn't look back. I still work here. I have to. The migration was declared a success. The 6th floor now has intermittent network issues, a permanent, unresolvable ticket in my queue that I am assigned to, and which I will never fix. I am its guardian. Its warden. The sitters are still here. They are confined to their floor now, their influence unable to spread through the wires. They seem to know what I did. Sometimes, in the lift or the canteen, I will catch their eyes. They look at me not with anger, but with a profound and patient sadness, as if I am a lost soul who has refused salvation. Chloe won't speak to me at all. I exist in the noise. I embrace it. The screech of the tram, the pointless office chatter, the frantic static in my own head. I welcome it all, because it is real, it is human, it is mine. But sometimes, when the office is quiet late at night, I can still feel it. A faint, residual pressure from 3 floors above. A deep and profound hush, waiting patiently. The chair is still there, in the room that doesn't exist. And it knows that all systems, eventually, fail. Behind the glass. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life, until recently, was measured in pixels and paragraphs. From my apartment on the 14th floor of a stoic concrete tower in Bella Vista, Sao Paulo became a living screensaver. I am, or was, Leonardo Vargas, a freelance translator. My work was a solitary communion with language, turning sterile English technical manuals into flowing, comprehensible Portuguese. The world came to me through a fiber optic cable, and I sent my work back the same way. The city was my backdrop, the view from my window a vast, dynamic painting I rarely touched. The window itself was the focal point of my apartment and, by extension, my life. A single, enormous pane of glass, wall to wall, ceiling to floor, it faced east, overlooking a canyon carved by Rua Augusta. Each morning, the nascent sun would spill sticky orange light over the endless sea of buildings, a sprawling concrete jungle gasping for air. I knew its topography intimately. The squat, brutalist office block with the perpetually defunct neon sign for a bank that failed in the 90s. The elegant, bone-white Art Deco apartment building, whose residents I imagined living lives far more glamorous than my own. The graffiti-slathered flank of a parking garage, a vibrant, chaotic mural that changed every few months. This was my city. My unchanging, reliable city. The first crack in that reliability was easy to dismiss. It was a Tuesday night, deep in a particularly dense chapter on hydraulic pump maintenance. My eyes were burning. I stood up, stretched, and walked to the window, my bare feet cold on the polished hardwood floor. The city glittered below, a billion golden synapses firing in the dark. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass, the faint vibration of the city's hum traveling through my skull. And I saw it. The Art Deco building, my favorite, was wrong. It had always been 8 stories high, a perfect, symmetrical stack of curved balconies. Tonight, it was 9. A phantom floor had been added, seamless and silent, its windows dark. I blinked. I rubbed my eyes so hard I saw phosphines bloom in the darkness. When I looked again, it was gone. 8 stories. Elegant, bone-white, and correct. Stress, I mumbled, the sound fogging a small patch of the glass. Too much caffeine, not enough sleep. I had recently broken up with Camila, and my sleep had been a shallow, choppy affair. My mind, she used to say, was like a browser with too many tabs open. It was a perfect explanation. My brain had glitched, rendering an extra floor for a split second. I went back to my desk and forced myself to focus on the intricacies of O-ring seals. A week later, the pedestrians started. It was mid-afternoon, the sky a hazy, bleached blue. I was taking a coffee break, watching the relentless flow of life on the street below. That's when I noticed the woman in the bright yellow dress. She walked from north to south, disappeared behind the corner newsstand, and then, 10 seconds later, reappeared at the starting point, walking the exact same path. I watched, mesmerized. She did it again. And again. A perfect, seamless loop. She wasn't alone. A man in a business suit, briefcase in hand, was doing the same on the opposite side of the street. A teenager on a skateboard ollied over the same crack in the pavement, over and over, a jerky, repeating gif. This was harder to rationalize. A film shoot. A street performance art piece. Sao Paulo was certainly strange enough to host such things without announcement. But there were no cameras, no crew, no audience. Just the silent, looping pantomime of a handful of people amidst the normal, chaotic flow of traffic and the rest of the crowd. I watched for 20 minutes, my coffee growing cold. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, they all broke their patterns and melted back into the random Brownian motion of the city. I felt a prickle of unease, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I took a picture with my phone, zooming in on the spot, but by then there was nothing to see but a normal, bustling street. The final anchor of my mundane reality came loose in the building's hallway. My neighbor, Donna Elsa from 14B, was a sweet, stooped woman who smelled of mothballs and fried onions. She was my only regular, real-world interaction. Every morning, if we happened to leave at the same time, she would greet me. Bom dia, meu filho. Deus te abençoe, she'd say, her voice a papery rustle. Good morning, my son. God bless you. That Friday, I ran into her on my way to the incinerator chute. Bom dia, meu filho. Deus te abençoe, she chirped, patting my arm. I smiled, gave her a bom dia, Dona Elsa, and went about my business. An hour later, I stepped out to check the mail. There she was again, just locking her door. She turned, her eyes lighting up as if seeing me for the first time that day. Bom dia, meu filho. Deus te abençoe, she said, with the exact same intonation, the exact same warm, crinkly smile. My own smile felt stiff, painted on. Bom dia, de novo, Dona Elsa, I said, trying to make it a small joke. She just blinked, her expression not registering my reply. It wasn't senility, it felt different. It was a script. A line delivered perfectly, with no room for improvisation. She patted my arm in the same spot and shuffled towards the elevator, humming a tune I couldn't quite place. I went back inside my apartment and locked the door, the deadbolt sounding unnervingly loud in the sudden silence. I walked to the window. The city outside looked normal. The sun was bright, the traffic was a snarled, honking mess. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at a forgery. A very, very good one. I tried to work, but the words on the screen were meaningless squiggles. My focus was gone, consumed by a low-grade hum of anxiety. I kept glancing at the window, then at my phone, then back again. I called Camila. I needed a voice of reason, a tether to the world I used to know. She answered on the third ring. Leo. Tudo bem? Hey. Yeah, I'm fine. Just wanted to hear your voice. Are you sure you're okay? You sound weird. I hesitated, knowing how it would sound. Camila, have you noticed anything strange lately? In the city? A pause. Strange how? The traffic is worse than usual, if that's what you mean. Her tone was light, teasing. No, not that. Like, things being out of place. People acting weird. Leo, everyone in Sao Paulo is weird. That's our charm. I could hear her smiling, but it didn't comfort me. You've been cooped up in that apartment for too long. You're starting to see ghosts in the concrete. Maybe, I said, my voice small. The brutalist office block across the way now had a series of dark, vertical stripes running down its facade, like rain stains where no rain had fallen. I was sure they weren't there yesterday. Yeah, maybe you're right. Go for a walk, Leo. Get some fresh air. It will do you good, she said, her voice softening with genuine concern. We can get coffee this weekend, if you want. Yeah. Okay. Weekend. We hung up, and I felt a profound sense of isolation wash over me. She hadn't seen it. It was just me. My brain, with its too many open tabs, was finally crashing. The thought was terrifying, but it was also, in a strange way, a comfort. A psychological problem was treatable. A reality problem was not. To prove it to myself, to prove Camila right, I decided to go for that walk. I grabbed my keys, put on my shoes, and took a deep breath. But as my hand reached for the doorknob, I glanced back at the window one last time. Down on the street, the looping woman in the yellow dress was back. And this time, she wasn't walking. She was standing perfectly still on the corner, her head tilted back, her face aimed directly at my building. At my floor. At my window. A man beside her did the same. Then a woman pushing a stroller. One by one, a small cluster of people on the street below stopped their pantomime and just stared. They stared up at me with a placid, unnerving stillness. They weren't angry or threatening. They were just watching. Like I was the spectacle. Like I was the one out of place. My hand froze on the doorknob. The metal felt ice cold. I don't know what's worse, that the city outside is changing, or that everyone in it keeps looking up at my window like I'm the one that's out of place. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I retreated to the center of my apartment, a prisoner between the watching street and a door I was suddenly too terrified to open. The quiet contagion wasn't just outside anymore. It had infected my resolve, my sanity, and now, my sanctuary. The glass of the window felt less like a barrier and more like the lens of a microscope. And I was the specimen on the slide. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The next few weeks bled into one another, a smear of beige anxiety. My world shrank to the 70 square meters of my apartment. Work became an impossibility. The technical manuals sat unopened, their deadlines screaming past in red-flagged emails I no longer had the capacity to care about. My life was now singular in its purpose, to watch. I started a journal, a simple black moleskine I christened the window log. The first few entries were frantic, detailing the changes with a desperate hope that documenting them would somehow make them real, provable. October 17th, the Art Deco building has 9 floors permanently now. I know it had 8. The top floor is always dark. No lights, ever. The looping pedestrians are a daily feature, from roughly 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. The woman in yellow is always there. I've started calling her Amarelinha. October 19th, a new change. The sound. The usual city symphony, the car horns, the distant sirens, the chatter from the. October 22nd. This is the one that broke me. I decided to test it. I took a high-resolution photo of the 9-story Art Deco building with my DSLR camera. I framed it perfectly. Click. I uploaded it to my computer, my heart pounding. And on the screen, clear as day, it had 8 stories. The photo showed the world as it. That discovery sent a jolt of pure, undiluted terror through me. It wasn't my memory that was faulty. It wasn't stress. The view itself was lying to me, and it was a lie so profound it could rewrite its own evidence. My isolation became absolute. Who could I tell? Hey, the world outside my window is a selectively edited version of reality, but don't worry, my camera says everything is fine. They wouldn't just think I was crazy, I would sound like the dictionary definition of it. I stopped answering my phone. Camila called a few times, then texted. Leo, are you okay? I'm worried. I read the message and felt a pang of guilt, but it was drowned out by the fear. What could I say? Her world, the world on the other end of that phone, was still the real one. Or was it? The thought was a snake, coiling in my gut. What if my window wasn't the anomaly? What if it was the only true thing left, and the rest of the world my phone and camera insisted on, was the lie? My paranoia began to feed on itself. I started searching online, diving into the murky depths of conspiracy forums and paranormal subreddits. I typed in phrases I was ashamed of: reality changing outside window, living in a simulation, urban dimensional bleed. Most of it was nonsense, ramblings from people who blamed aliens or secret government projects for their lost car keys. But buried deep within a forum called Urban Anomalies and Liminal Spaces, I found a thread titled The Viewport Effect. It was started by a user named Observador. The post was terse, clinical. Subject, the viewport effect. Have you ever noticed persistent, unverifiable changes to a familiar view? A view you see every day, from a fixed position, e.g., home office window, favorite park bench. Changes are subtle at first. Architectural impossibilities. Behavioral loops in pedestrians. Sensory distortion, muffled sounds, odd colors. Attempts to document, photos, video, will fail. The recording will show the baseline reality, not the altered one. Do not attempt to engage with the altered elements. You are an observer. Maintain your status. My breath hitched. It was my experience, described perfectly. I wasn't alone. I devoured the thread. There were only a handful of replies, scattered over years. One from a woman in Tokyo describing a skyscraper that would vanish in the fog and reappear with a different logo. Another from a man in London who swore the path of the sun over his council flat had shifted by a few degrees. They were all dismissed by other forum members as hoaxes or mental illness. But I knew. They were seeing it too. My secondary mystery, the people staring up at my window, began to evolve. It was no longer just Amarelinha and her small group. Now, at random times, the entire visible street would fall silent. All the cars would stop. Every pedestrian, even the ones who seemed normal, would freeze in place, tilt their heads back, and stare up at me. The silence was the most terrifying part. A slice of Sao Paulo, one of the world's noisiest cities, brought to a complete standstill. An audience of thousands, their eyes all fixed on my 14th floor apartment. During these moments, I would crawl on the floor, staying below the level of the glass, my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against the hardwood. The silence would last for maybe a minute, then the sound would rush back in, the cars would move, the people would resume their business as if nothing had happened. My routine, once based on work, was now a ritual of survival. I subsisted on the dwindling supplies in my pantry, rice, beans, stale crackers. Going outside was not an option. The staring had made that clear. The outside was their territory. Dona Elsa's script never wavered. Biomgia, meu filho. Deus te abençoe. I started avoiding the hallway, pressing my ear to the door before daring to open it to take out the trash. The building's doorman, Zika, a man I'd once shared jokes with about football, was now a hollow shell. He'd sit in his booth, staring straight ahead, his face utterly blank. If I passed, he'd give a slow, mechanical nod, his eyes never truly focusing on me. The contagion was seeping through the walls. One evening, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, I decided to order a pizza. It was a stupid risk, but the thought of hot cheese and fresh dough was an unbearable temptation. I paid online, adding a large tip and a note, "Please leave at the door." I watched the delivery tracker on my phone, a little dot making its way through a map of the real Sao Paulo, a city I could no longer access. When the tracker said he had arrived, I crept to my door and looked through the peephole. A young man in a red polo shirt stood there, pizza box in hand. Relief washed over me. He looked normal. He knocked. "Pizza for Leo," he called out, his voice tinny through the door. My hand was on the deadbolt when I looked through the peephole again. His face, it was still there, but it was wrong. It was too smooth. Like a mannequin. The features were there, eyes, nose, mouth, but they were devoid of life, of texture. His eyes didn't blink. His mouth hung slightly open, a perfect, dark O. He knocked again, the sound precisely the same as the first. A looped sound. I stumbled back from the door, a scream caught in my throat. I didn't open it. I waited, crouched in my hallway, for what felt like an hour. He never left. I could feel his presence through the wood, a silent, patient sentinel. Finally, I crawled to the window and dared to peek over the sill. Down below, on the street, a pizza delivery motorcycle was parked at the curb. Beside it, the same young man in the red polo shirt was standing, staring up at my window. He was in two places at once. The silent, waiting thing outside my door, and the observer on the street below. He was part of the audience. The pizza box lay on the pavement beside him, forgotten. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The anomaly wasn't just outside my window anymore. It was at my door. It was testing the perimeter. The glass was no longer the only boundary. Now, it was the wood and steel of my front door. My prison had just gotten smaller. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The encounter with the pizza delivery boy, the twin delivery boys, shattered my last vestiges of hope for a rational explanation. This wasn't a psychological break. My mind, however stressed, could not conjure a physical presence outside my door. The barrier between my observation post and the phenomenon itself was thinning. The glass was becoming permeable. My sanctuary now felt like a cage designed by a sadist. The dwindling food supply was a ticking clock. Hunger gnawed at me, a dull ache that sharpened my fear. I rationed my remaining crackers and a forgotten jar of olives, eating just enough to keep the dizziness at bay. Thirst was manageable, the water from the tap still ran clear, though I had started boiling it obsessively, irrationally afraid the contagion could travel through the pipes. In my desperation, I turned back to the Urban Anomalies forum. I sent a private message to Observador, my fingers shaking as I typed out the story of the pizza delivery. I didn't expect a reply. It felt like shouting into a void. To my astonishment, a response came within the hour. From Observador. To Leo Vargas. Subject, it's at my door. The perimeter is being tested. This is a significant escalation. They are aware of your awareness. The pizza was a probe, a social lure. Your refusal to engage was the correct response. Opening the door would have been a form of consent. You would have been integrated. Integrated? The word was cold, clinical, and utterly terrifying. I replied instantly. Integrated into what? What is this thing? Who are they? From Observador. To Leo Vargas. Subject, it's at my door. Theories are insufficient. Think of it not as an invasion, but as a change in state, like water turning to ice. Reality is recrystallizing around certain anchor points. For whatever reason, your apartment, your specific point of observation, is one of those points. You are in a pocket of the old reality, looking out at the new. The viewport. But the pocket is shrinking. They are not a conscious entity in a way we would understand. They are the new state. The people who stare, the loopers, they are the ones who have already crystallized. They look at you because you are dissonant. You are liquid in a solid world. You are a flaw in the pattern. My advice remains the same, but it is now urgent: do not leave. Do not interact. But you must also reinforce your dissonance. You must assert your own reality against the one being imposed from outside. The message was both a lifeline and a death sentence. It gave a name, a shape, to my terror, but it also confirmed my imprisonment. Reinforce my dissonance. How was I supposed to fight a war against the fabric of reality with nothing but my own mind? Observador's next message offered a suggestion. From Observador. To Leo Vargas. Subject, a possible defense. The phenomenon relies on passive observation and creeping acceptance. It normalizes itself. You must actively denormalize it. Focus on things that are unique to your reality. Memories. Play music that has deep personal meaning. Look at old photographs. An ally. I finally had an ally. A strange, anonymous voice in the dark, but an ally nonetheless. A sliver of hope, sharp and painful, pierced through my fear. I followed the instructions with the fervor of a zealot. I dug out an old shoebox of photographs. There was one of my parents on their wedding day, my father's goofy grin, my mother's radiant smile. I taped it to the wall beside my desk. I found another of Camila and me at the beach in Ubadaba, squinting in the sun, our arms around each other. The memory was a physical ache in my chest. I stared at it, forcing myself to remember the smell of the salt spray, the heat of the sand, the sound of her laughter. I started tapping on the window. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, a quiet, persistent rhythm against the encroaching strangeness. I hummed old bossa nova tunes, letting the melancholic melodies of Joe Beam fill the silence of the apartment. I was fighting back with memory, with emotion, with math and music. For a few days, it seemed to work. The staring spells became less frequent. The sounds from the street seemed less looped, more chaotic and natural. A flicker of victory. But the phenomenon adapted. The environmental warping escalated, as if my resistance was provoking it. The buildings visible from my window began to subtly shift their positions overnight, crowding closer together. The sky took on a permanent, sickly ochre hue, a perpetual sunset that never resolved into day or night. Shadows in my own apartment began to behave oddly, stretching at unnatural angles, clinging to corners long after I moved the lamp. A vase of dead flowers I'd forgotten on the kitchen counter rearranged its withered stems into a perfect spiral when I wasn't looking. My ally, Observador, became my only tether. We exchanged messages daily. I was the field agent, he was my handler. But then his messages started to change. They grew more specific, more demanding. From Observador to Leo Vargas. Subject, a new instruction. The tapping is good. The music is good. Now, you must synchronize. At 3:33 p.m. tomorrow, stand before the window. You must chant the name, Camila, exactly 33 times. While you do this, stare at the 9-story Art Deco building. Do not look away. This is crucial. It will create a sympathetic resonance. It will stabilize your pocket. A cold knot of suspicion formed in my stomach. It felt wrong. It felt like a ritual. It felt less like defense and more like participation. The previous advice was about asserting my reality. This felt like I was being asked to perform for theirs. I messaged him back. Why? What will that do? This feels different. The reply was almost instantaneous. From Observador to Leo Vargas. Subject, a new instruction. Doubt is a form of acceptance. You must trust the process. You are the anomaly, Leo. We are trying to tune you. To fix you. Stand before the glass. We are all waiting. We are all waiting. My blood ran cold. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. Observador wasn't an ally. He wasn't another victim. He was one of them. Or worse. He was a recruiter. A lure, just like the pizza, but for my mind instead of my body. My hope curdled into a new, more profound paranoia. I hadn't found a fellow prisoner. I had been corresponding with the warden. I stumbled over to my laptop and slammed it shut, severing the connection. The silence in the apartment was absolute. I was truly, utterly alone. My pathetic attempts at resistance, the tapping, the humming, the photographs, felt like a child's game, a game whose rules had been written by the monster I was trying to fight. I had been played. The rage came then, hot and clarifying. I was not a flaw in the pattern to be fixed. I was not a specimen to be tuned. I was a man, trapped in a box, and I would not perform for my captors. I walked to the window, my bare feet slapping against the floor. The ochre sky pulsed faintly. The buildings leaned in, like silent giants straining to listen. I looked down at the street. And I waited. I didn't have to wait long. The silence fell. The cars stopped. The pedestrians froze. 1,000 faces turned upward. The audience was assembled. I met their blank, collective gaze. I didn't hide. I didn't crawl away. I stood there, in full view, and I raised my hand. And with a single, defiant finger, I gave them the bird. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, down on the street, one of the figures moved. It detached itself from the frozen crowd and started walking. It walked with a purpose the others lacked, a smooth, familiar gait. It was wearing my gray hoodie, the one slung over my desk chair. It had my posture, my dark, messy hair. It was me. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation and Aftermath. Time seemed to stutter, the moment stretching into a syrupy eternity. The figure on the street, the other Leo, walked to the center of the road, directly under my window. The frozen audience of crystallized people formed a silent amphitheater around him. He stopped, tilted his head back, and looked up. Our eyes met through 14 stories of distance and a pane of reality-warping glass. There was no malice in his expression. No anger. Just a placid, almost pitying, curiosity. He had my face, but it was a version of my face I hadn't seen in years. It was rested. Calm. Unburdened by fear or anxiety. It was the face of a man who belonged in his world. He raised a hand, not in a threat, but in a small, casual wave. And then, he smiled. A knowing, confident smile that felt like a key turning in a lock I didn't know existed. The confrontation I had been dreading wasn't going to be one of violence or horror in the traditional sense. It was a psychological checkmate. The question that screamed through my mind was simple and devastating: which one of us was the ghost? Was he the real Leonardo Vargas, out there living a life in this new, strange version of Sao Paulo, while I, a psychic echo, a digital remnant, was left behind, trapped in this observational fishbowl, watching a life that was no longer mine? Had I died in my sleep weeks ago, and this apartment was my own private, looping purgatory? Or was I the original, and he was the replacement? A calm, compliant version created by the phenomenon to take my place, to smooth over the flaw in the pattern that I represented. The implications of either possibility were a spiral staircase into madness. My defiance, my grand gesture of flipping off the universe, felt childish and pathetic. I wasn't a rebel fighting the system. I was a glitch, a bug in the code, and the system had just instantiated a clean copy and was proceeding as normal. The outside Leo was going to go for a coffee, meet friends, maybe even call Camila, while I starved to death, tapping prime numbers on a window. The outside Leo's smile faded. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. As if disappointed, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd which simultaneously unfroze and resumed its motion. The sound of the city rushed back in, but it was different now. It no longer sounded muffled or looped. It sounded clear, sharp, and profoundly alien. It was the sound of a world I was no longer a part of. The hunger in my belly was a sharp, physical pain, but it was nothing compared to the hollowing void that had opened in my soul. Observador's words echoed in my head. "We are trying to tune you. To fix you." They hadn't wanted to destroy me. They had wanted me to join them. The chants, the rituals, they were an invitation. An orientation process. My refusal, my defiance, was my damnation. I had chosen to remain an anomaly, and so I had been rendered obsolete. I stood there for an hour, maybe more, as the ochre sky deepened into a bruised purple. The fight was gone. What was left was a terrifying clarity. There were only two paths left. I could stay here and waste away, a ghost haunting my own apartment, watching a life I couldn't have through a glass screen. Or I could leave. Leave. The thought was no longer terrifying. What was there left to be afraid of? The ultimate horror had already happened. I had been replaced. My reality had been invalidated. Opening the door wasn't a risk anymore, it was the only variable I had left to control. What would happen? Would I dissolve into nothingness the moment I crossed the threshold? Would I merge with the other Leo, our consciousnesses combining in some horrifying synthesis? Or would I simply step out and become one of them? My face smoothing into a blank mask, my will erased, destined to walk in a loop or stand on a corner, staring up at the next poor soul trapped behind the glass. It was a choice between a slow, certain death of the body, or a quick, certain death of the self. I turned away from the window, my back to the alien city that wore my city's face. My apartment, once my sanctuary and then my prison, now felt like a waiting room. The shoebox of photos, the humming, the tapping, it was all the desperate scrabbling of an animal in a trap, an animal that never realized the cage door had been open all along, leading directly into a much, much larger cage. I walked to the front door. My hand, steady now, closed around the cool metal of the doorknob. There was no hesitation, no final, panicked thought. Just a strange, calm resignation. A curiosity to see the end of the story. I took one last look back. I glanced at the window, at the vast pane of glass that had been the lens of my undoing. Down on the street, everything had stopped again. The cars, the buses, the endless river of pedestrians. The entire world visible through my window was frozen solid. And every single person, every single pair of eyes in that crystallized city, was turned upwards. Toward me. The other Leo was gone. The audience was no longer watching him. He was old news. They were watching me. Waiting for my final act. They were the silent, expectant crowd in the theater, and I was the actor on the stage, about to make my exit. My lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. I finally understood. The contagion wasn't changing the world to isolate me. It was changing the world to feature me. I wasn't the one behind the glass. Everyone else was. It was a gallery. And I was the exhibit. I turned the knob. The lock made a soft, final click. The receipts don't match. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My world is measured in the hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic beeping of the checkout scanner. I am Leo, night manager of the greengrocers on the corner of Milwaukee and a street that keeps trying to forget its own name. This part of Chicago is a battleground of aesthetics. On one side of the avenue, you have bodegas with sun-faded awnings and taquerias that smell like history. On our side, you have us, and the new places, a yoga studio with a Sanskrit name, a coffee shop that calls itself a roastery, and apartment buildings with names like the Fulcrum or Axis. Sterile, angular words for sterile, angular lives. My life is anything but angular. It's a loop. Arrive at 10 p.m. Review the day's shift's notes. Walk the floor. Supervise Jamal as he stocks shelves. Deal with the occasional late-night rush of college students or third-shift workers. Lock up at 7 a.m. Go home. Sleep. Repeat. It's a life that thrives on predictability. The price of milk might go up a few cents, the seasons might change the selection in produce, but the fundamentals are immutable. An apple is an apple. The first tremor in that foundation was a slip of paper. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The hours blur. A woman, one of the new residents from the Fulcrum, bought a bag of gala apples, a carton of organic milk, and a loaf of sourdough. I was covering a cashier's break. I scanned her items. The apple beeped. On my screen, the description read, Unit A43. I blinked. Hold on a sec, I said, picking up the apple again. It was firm, red, vaguely waxy. It was an apple. I scanned it again. Unit A43. Is there a problem? the woman asked, her voice impatient. She was tapping a perfect manicure on the credit card reader. No, sorry. System's just being weird. I glanced at the sticker on the fruit itself. It had the usual brand logo and the tiny PLU code, 4135. Not A43. I manually entered the PLU. The screen flashed, item not found. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This was new. Inefficient. Apologies. The system's just been updated. It's a little idiosyncratic. I used the touchscreen to find the Apple icon under Produce. The system charged her the correct price. The printed receipt, however, still read, Unit A43, $2.49. She didn't look at it, of course. Nobody does. She just stuffed it in her purse and was gone. Hey, Jamal, I called out as he wheeled a U-boat of dairy products down aisle 2. You seen anything weird with the new POS system? The one corporate pushed last week? Jamal, who was 22 and believed in the sacred gospel of corporate memos, shrugged. You mean very system? Nah, it's smooth. Way more efficient. Streamlines the whole inventory process. It just called an Apple, Unit A43. Yeah, it's a new SKU logic, he said, not even looking up from his task. They're migrating everything. Getting rid of brand-specific identifiers for a universal classification. It's smarter. It didn't feel smarter. It felt like a mistake. A piece of data that had fallen through the cracks. For the rest of the night, I watched the receipts. A bottle of bleach was cleansing agent 7. A can of chickpeas was legume sphere, canned. It was unsettling, but Jamal's explanation was a neat, corporate-approved box to put my anxiety in. An update. A new system. I told myself to adapt. The world changes, Leo. Even the names of things. A week later, Mrs. Petrova came in. She was a fixture, a relic from the neighborhood's Polish and Ukrainian past. Her spine was a question mark and her face was a roadmap of 80 years of Chicago winters. She bought the same things every week, a small container of cottage cheese, a jar of beets, and a single, large banana. I rang her up myself. I always did. We had a rhythm. I'd ask about her cats. She'd complain about the noise from the new construction. And the one banana, she said, placing it on the counter. It was yellow, slightly bruised, perfect for her. I weighed it. Scanned the sticker. My screen read, tropical fruit, elongated yellow. I stared at it. Not a code. Not a number. A description. A cold, clinical, alien description. As if written by someone who had never seen a banana before and was cataloging it for a museum of extinct foods. Everything all right, Leo? Mrs. Petrova asked, her voice a fragile rasp. Fine, Mrs. P. Just fine. I looked at the receipt after she'd shuffled away. Cottage cheese, $3.19. Beets, Jared, $2.89. Tropical fruit, elongated yellow, 47 cents. That night, I started the journal. A cheap, spiral-bound notebook I took from stationery. On the first page, I wrote, receipts don't match. Something is wrong with the words. The anomaly wasn't confined to the register. A few days later, Jamal was stocking the dairy case. Hey, Leo, he called over, day shift shorted us on the nutrient fluid again. I stopped my paperwork. The what? Nutrient fluid. For the coolers. He gestured with his head toward the gallons of milk. You mean milk, Jamal? He gave me a strange look, a flicker of confusion mixed with pity. The kind of look you give an old man who's forgotten his own address. Yeah. Milk. Whatever. Corporate wants us to use the official terminology for inventory reports. nutrient fluid, bovine, grade A. It's on the very system manifest. He said the word milk like it was a piece of slang, a nickname he was phasing out. I walked over to the dairy case. The plastic jugs were the same. The cows on the label were the same. But the large print, the friendly, familiar, whole milk, now seemed thinner. The letters looked faded, less confident, as if the ink was losing its conviction. I ran my thumb over the words. They felt frail. The gentrification across the street continued its march. The old laundromat with the cracked tile floor closed down. A month later, it reopened as The Spin Cycle, a laundry experience. Their sign was brushed steel with a minimalist font. They didn't wash clothes, they curated cleanliness. I started seeing the change in the language everywhere. The menu at the coffee shop stopped offering lattes and cappuccinos. Now it was steamed milk and espresso, Form A, and steamed milk and espresso, Form B. People ordered them without batting an eye. They'd stand in line, staring at their phones, and say, "I'll have a Form B and a flake pastry." Not a croissant. A flake pastry. I felt a growing sense of vertigo, as if the ground was solid under my feet but the map I was using to navigate it was dissolving in my hands. I was becoming a tourist in my own neighborhood, in my own life. The breaking point was small, mundane, and utterly terrifying. I was in the back, organizing the overstock. The storeroom is my sanctuary. It's chaos, but it's my chaos. I know every box, every stain on the concrete floor. I reached for a case of Del Monte corn. I knew exactly where it should be. It wasn't there. Instead, there was a case of Sparkle brand paper towels. I froze. I had stacked that corn myself 6 hours earlier. I was sure of it. I looked around. The entire bay of shelving was different. Canned vegetables were now where cleaning supplies should be. I felt a dizzy spell, leaning against the rack. The metal was cold and real. But it was in the wrong place. When I walked back out to the main floor, my heart pounding, I saw Jamal meticulously adjusting the cans in the soup aisle. He was moving a row of Campbell's tomato to the spot where the chicken noodle was supposed to be. "Jamal, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "That's not the planogram." He turned, holding a can of tomato soup. The label was bright red, iconic. Corporate sent a new layout logic through the very system this afternoon. It's optimizing customer flow based on purchase path analytics. We're supposed to have it done by morning. He looked at the can in his hand. We're low on the red soup. My blood ran cold. He couldn't think of the word. Not Campbell's. Not tomato. The red soup. Tomato soup, Jamal. He blinked slowly. Yeah. That one. He turned back to the shelf, his movements smooth and untroubled. He placed the can of red soup in its new, incorrect home. That night I went home and the city felt alien. The rumble of the L train overhead wasn't a familiar comfort, it was a nameless noise. The streetlights flickered, and for a moment I was convinced they were blinking in a code I couldn't understand. I walked into my apartment and looked at the framed print on my wall, a cheap reproduction of Hopper's Nighthawks. I'd had it for years. I stared at the lonely figures in the diner, at the stark, beautiful sadness of it. And for the life of me, I couldn't remember the name of the painting. I only knew that I was on the outside of the glass, looking in. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. My spiral notebook became my anchor in a sea of dissolving concepts. I started documenting everything, my handwriting growing smaller, more frantic. Day 15, milk is consistently nutrient fluid. Jamal no longer uses the old word at all. Maria, the store manager, called it that in the morning meeting. I asked her about it. She said, "It's just the official term, Leo. Keep up." Day 21, the labels are changing. Not just the digital price tags. The actual printed labels on the cans. The word corn on the Del Monte can is gone. In its place is a small, neat square with the code C4ZA. Below it, in tiny print, maize kernel, preserved. The logo is still there, but it looks lonely, orphaned from its purpose. Day 28, aisle 3 is gone. It's not that the aisle itself vanished, the sign now reads, aisle 4. There are 2 aisle 4s, separated by what used to be aisle 5, now aisle 6. I pointed this out to Maria. She looked at me, her face a mask of weary impatience. Leo, the layout has been like this for months. Are you feeling okay? Maybe you should take a few days off. The world was gaslighting me. My own boss, a woman I'd worked with for 5 years, was telling me my memory was faulty, that my perception of reality was the bug, not the system. The isolation was a physical presence now, a heavy cloak I couldn't take off. It was in the vacant stares of my co-workers, the placid acceptance of the customers, the quiet, inexorable logic of the very system. I tried to fight back in my own small ways. I took a marker and wrote bread on the shelf tag for starch loaf, sliced. The next night, the tag was gone, replaced by a fresh, clean one. I tried talking to customers. Funny how they call it carbonated water, flavored now, isn't it? I'd say with a forced laugh as I scanned a can of LaCroix. They would just smile politely, a non-committal, frictionless social gesture, and thank me for their receipt. My search for an ally became desperate. I thought I'd found one in Mrs. Petrova. She, at least, was a creature of the old world. She still called things by their names. One evening, I saw her standing in the produce section, looking lost. She was staring at the bananas. The sign above them now read tropical curvefruit. It's madness, isn't it, Mrs. P? I said, walking up to her gently. She turned to me, her eyes clouded with genuine confusion, not the placid emptiness of the others. Leo, she whispered, clutching my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. I came for the yellow things. For my breakfast. Bananas, I said, my heart aching. They're called bananas. Banana, she repeated, the word a foreign shape in her mouth. Yes. I think so. It is so hard to remember. Everything changes. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. She saw it too. Her age, her natural memory decline, was somehow making her more sensitive to this artificial erasure, not less. I remember, I told her, my voice low and urgent. I'm keeping track. I know what things are called. I started making it a point to talk to her every time she came in. I would point to things and name them. This is a potato, Mrs. P. This is rye bread. This is an onion. She would nod, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a brief, lucid moment before the fog rolled back in. She was my secret, a tiny pocket of resistance. My small, secondary mystery began in the storeroom. Tucked away behind a stack of unused shelving units, I found a dusty cardboard box. It was full of old store records from before the greengrocer's chain bought this location, back when it was a family-owned market called Stan's Superette. Inside were faded employee manuals from the 1990s, laminated planograms drawn by hand, and stacks of old inventory sheets. These papers were my Rosetta Stone. They were filled with obsolete, beautiful words. Jell-O. Windex. Spam. They listed brands that had long since vanished, products that no longer existed. But more importantly, they listed the basics. Apples, milk, bread, cheese. The pages felt sacred, artifacts from a reality that was being systematically dismantled. I took one of the manuals home, hiding it in my apartment like contraband. It was proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy. The gentrification subplot, as I thought of it, continued to provide a chilling parallel. The new buildings weren't just sterile, they were actively hostile to the past. The city approved the demolition of a 100-year-old brick building with beautiful terracotta details to make way for a glass and steel fitness center called Evolve. The name felt like a threat. My paranoia deepened. I started to wonder if the very system and the gentrification were connected. Both were about erasing the old, the specific, the inefficient, and replacing it with a clean, universal, and utterly soulless alternative. Was this some grand corporate conspiracy? A social engineering project on a massive scale? I tried to research very system online. The corporate website was a masterpiece of meaningless jargon. Synergizing legacy assets with next-generation data architecture to create a frictionless commercial ecosystem. It was the same linguistic void that was infecting my store. There were no people on the website, just abstract graphics of flowing data streams and interconnected nodes. It was a company with no face, no address, just a presence. A ghost in the machine. The machine that was now running my world. The hope I'd placed in Mrs. Petrova was fragile, and it was about to break. I hadn't seen her for 2 weeks. I was getting worried. I found her address in our old customer loyalty database, a system we weren't supposed to use anymore but whose password I had memorized. On my day off, I walked the 6 blocks to her small brick apartment building. I found her sitting on her front stoop, watching the cars go by. "Mrs. Petrova?" I said, approaching slowly. She looked up at me. There was no recognition in her eyes. Not even the flicker of confusion I had come to rely on. Just a calm, pleasant blankness. "Hello," she said, her voice even. "It's me, Leo. From the store." "The greengrocer's." "The store," she repeated, nodding. "Yes. The place with the things." My heart sank. "Mrs. P, do you remember what we talked about? The names of things? Bananas?" She smiled a serene, empty smile. "The elongated yellow fruit is very good. It has a high value of unit peak 12. Unit peak 12. Potassium." The concept hadn't been erased, just reclassified. Stripped of its soul. She had been fully integrated. The contagion had consumed my only ally, leaving behind a placid shell. The loss wasn't violent. It was quiet. She looked peaceful, content even. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. I walked away from her building feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The isolation was no longer a cloak, it was my skin. I clutched the old Stan Superette manual in my jacket pocket. It felt like the last dictionary in a world that had forgotten how to speak. The streets of my neighborhood, a mix of old brick and new steel, felt like a museum of a forgotten language. And I was the only one left who could read the placards. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The loss of Mrs. Petrova broke something in me. My passive observation turned into a quiet, desperate investigation. If I couldn't find an ally in the present, I would have to find answers in the past. My life outside the store shrank to my small apartment and the glow of my laptop screen. The corporate website for Very System was a dead end, a hall of mirrors built from buzzwords. But corporations have to be registered. They have to file patents. I spent hours, fueled by caffeine and a growing dread, digging through public records and patent databases. And then I found it. Very System wasn't a software company. Not really. Its parent corporation was a holding company called Aderna, a name that dripped with unsettling ambition. Aderna had its fingers in everything: logistics, data analysis, urban planning, even neuro-linguistic programming research. Their patents weren't for inventory software, they were for things like dynamic environmental structuring, cognitive path optimization, and, the one that made me feel physically ill, conceptual normalization protocol. The patent description was dense, clinical, and horrifying. It spoke of using low-frequency data broadcasts and resonant algorithmic patterns to reduce cognitive friction and streamline semantic fields. It wasn't about making inventory more efficient. It was about making thought more efficient. It was designed to slowly, subtly overwrite the messy, chaotic, specific language of humanity with a cleaner, more logical, machine-readable syntax. It wasn't a contagion in the biological sense. It was an upgrade. A firmware update for reality, being pushed out through the store's network, through the city's infrastructure, through the very airwaves. The flickering streetlights weren't random, they were part of the broadcast. The rearranging shelves weren't a glitch, they were dynamic environmental structuring in action. The loss of words wasn't a side effect, it was the entire point. Eliminate ambiguity. Eliminate sentimentality, history, poetry. An apple is just Unit A43. A human life is just another dataset. The stakes escalated in ways I couldn't have predicted. The anomaly was no longer just passive. It was becoming responsive. One night, I was in the storeroom, poring over the stand's Superette manual. I was comparing its list of products with our current inventory, trying to measure the scale of the loss. Jamal walked in. "Leo, Maria's looking for the manifest for the, he trailed off, his eyes landing on the old, laminated book in my hands. He frowned. "What's that?" "It's an old employee manual," I said, my body tensing. He walked closer, a strange curiosity on his face. He looked at the page, at the grainy black and white photos of products, at the words, potato chips and soda pop. A look of profound, painful confusion crossed his features, like a computer trying to process a corrupted file. "That's inefficient data," he said, the words sounding rehearsed, like they were supplied to him. "Redundant. The system has a better way." He reached for the manual. I pulled it back instinctively. "It's just historical interest, Jamal." His eyes narrowed. For the first time, I saw something other than placid acceptance in him. I saw a flicker of the system itself. A sterile, corrective impulse. That information conflicts with the current operational schema. It can cause semantic dissonance. Semantic dissonance. He was speaking its language now. "It's a book, Jamal. It's harmless. All data has an effect," he said, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on the manual. "Obsolete data should be archived. Or purged." He didn't try to take it again. He just stood there for a moment, the flicker of hostility fading back into his usual blankness, and then turned and walked away. The encounter left me shaking. The system wasn't just overriding reality, it was beginning to defend itself against anything that contradicted it. My precious manual wasn't a dictionary, it was a virus. And I was the carrier. The environmental warping grew more pronounced. It was no longer just shelves rearranging themselves overnight. Things began to happen in real time. I would walk down an aisle, and for a split second, I'd see the shelves ripple, the products blurring into a gray paste before snapping back into focus. Shadows in the corners of the storeroom would stretch and twist in ways that defied the single, buzzing light bulb. One morning, as I was leaving, I glanced back at the big greengrocer's sign. For a heartbeat, the letters dissolved and reformed into a single, elegant, meaningless symbol, like a corporate logo from another dimension. My apartment, once my sanctuary, no longer felt safe. I'd come home and the books on my shelf would be rearranged, not by title or author, but by color. The hopper print on my wall seemed to change. One day the diner was empty. The next, there were 5 figures instead of 3. I was afraid to sleep, terrified of what might be optimized or streamlined while I was unconscious. My desperation led me to one last, foolish attempt at finding an ally. I thought about the gentrification, the old versus new tension. Maybe the resistance wasn't in the people, but in the places. Across the street, nestled between the Revolve Fitness Center and the Spin Cycle, was one last bastion of the old world, La Magia, a tiny botanica that had been there for 50 years. It smelled of incense, dried herbs, and something ancient. The windows were crammed with candles, statues of saints, and charms. It was the absolute antithesis of the very system's clean, logical world. The woman behind the counter, Elena, was old, with eyes that seemed to see more than just the physical world. I walked in, the bell above the door chiming a delicate, real sound. "I need help," I said, my voice cracking. "Something is wrong with the world. It's forgetting." She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Forgetting is a kind of peace." "No, this is different. Things are being erased. Replaced." I pulled the Stan's manual from my bag, my hands trembling. "This is what things used to be called. This is real." She looked at the book but didn't take it. "Words are containers. You are upset because the containers are changing. But what of the thing inside? The thing inside is being lost too. A memory, a feeling, a taste. It's all being stripped away until there's nothing left but a code." Elena lit a stick of sandalwood incense, the smoke curling up towards the ceiling. "There are spirits in everything, young man. In the machines as well as the stones. Some spirits are hungry. They devour names. This is an old story." She thought I was talking about spirits. Maybe I was. I tried to explain about very system, about Adana, about the patents. She just listened, nodding slowly. "You carry too much of the past," she said finally. "It makes you heavy. You cannot see the new world because you are clinging to the wreckage of the old one. Sometimes, the only way to survive is to let go of the shore." It was the worst thing she could have said. It was the logic of the system, just dressed in mystical robes. Acceptance. Adaptation. Surrender. I had thought this place, this woman, would be an island of resistance. Instead, it was just another voice telling me to drown quietly. I stumbled out of the botanica, the scent of sandalwood clinging to me. Elena hadn't been an ally. She was a priestess of a different kind of surrender. Her way was ancient and organic, the systems was technological and sterile, but their gospel was the same: the individual memory is meaningless in the face of inevitable change. That night at the store, the final phase began. The digital price tags on the shelves no longer displayed codes or descriptions. They were all blank, emitting a soft, uniform white light. The products themselves were losing their color, the vibrant reds of the apples and the bright oranges of the citrus fruits fading to a muted, uniform grayish palette. The store was being prepared for a total reset. And I was locked inside with it. Phase 4, Confrontation and Aftermath. The hum was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't the usual chorus of coolers and fluorescents. This was a new sound, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in my teeth. It was the sound of the system working, not in the background, but in the foreground. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the store into absolute darkness. My breath caught in my throat. The emergency lights didn't kick in. But it wasn't dark for long. A soft, sterile, white light began to emanate from the shelves themselves, from the blank price tags, from the floor tiles. The store was generating its own light, a light with no warmth, no source, and no shadows. Then came the movement. It started as a soft, grinding sound, like stone on stone. I looked down the main aisle. The massive shelving unit at the far end was gliding, moving silently across the floor, its metal base leaving no mark on the pristine linoleum. Another unit from aisle 2 began to move, turning on a central axis with impossible grace. The store was reconfiguring itself. It was a physical manifestation of a hard drive being defragmented. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I ran for the front doors. The automatic doors, usually so responsive, were inert. A flat metal panel had slid down over the glass from within the frame, sealing it completely. I was trapped. I turned back to the impossible sight. The aisles were no longer aisles. They were flowing, shifting corridors. The logical, grid-like layout of the supermarket was dissolving into a fluid, organic, and deeply alien architecture. A wall of what used to be cereal boxes slid past me, the packaging a uniform, featureless gray. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The confrontation. Not with a person, not with a monster, but with the process itself. With the quiet, implacable will of the very system. I backed away, stumbling into the space that used to be the produce section. My hand knocked something off a shelf. It was an apple. Or what had been an apple. It was the size and shape of one, but its color was a dull, putty gray. It felt cold and smooth, like polished stone. There was no scent. I dropped it, and it hit the floor with a dense, plastic thud. My mind raced. What was the goal? What did the system want? And then I knew. It wanted consistency. It wanted purity. It was purging the anomalies, the last vestiges of the old, messy reality. The conflicting data. And the biggest piece of conflicting data in the entire building was me. My head was full of it, the memory of the taste of a real banana, the name of Hopper's painting, the layout of Stan's superette, the sound of Mrs. Petrova saying my name. I was a walking, breathing contradiction to this new, clean world. I scrambled for the storeroom, the shifting landscape of the store trying to herd me, to guide my path. The storeroom door was gone. The wall was a seamless, smooth surface. No escape. I was cornered in what was now a central chamber, a hub where several of the flowing pathways of shelving converged. I clutched the Stan's superette manual to my chest. It was the only weapon I had. The only proof. The hum intensified, and the light brightened. I felt a strange pressure in my skull, a feeling of being scanned. Read. The system was focused on me, on the dissonant data I represented. I had a choice. I could fight. I could scream the old words into the sterile silence. I could cling to my memories until my mind broke. Or I could do what Jamal had done, what Mrs. Petrova had done, what Elena had advised. I could let go of the shore. I opened the manual to a random page. A picture of a can of Franco-American SpaghettiOs. The name was so specific, so silly, so human. I focused on it, on the memory of its taste from my childhood. I held it in my mind like a shield. The pressure in my head became a sharp pain. The light was blinding. The shelves stopped moving, forming a perfect, symmetrical circle around me. The system was waiting. It was giving me a chance to integrate. To willingly purge the obsolete data. Let go, a voice whispered in my mind. It wasn't a voice of words, but of pure, streamlined logic. It is more efficient. It is peaceful. I looked at the gray, featureless apple on the floor. I thought of Mrs. Petrova's empty, serene smile. Peace. Forgetting was a kind of peace. And in that moment, my will broke. The fight was too exhausting. The isolation was too complete. What was the point of being the last man to remember the word apple in a world where apples no longer existed? Okay, I whispered to the silent, watching room. Okay. I let the manual slip from my fingers. It fell to the floor, landing with a soft thud. The pressure in my head eased. The blinding light softened. The pain subsided, replaced by a strange and hollow calm. I looked at the manual on the floor. It was just an object now. A collection of paper with meaningless markings on it. The word SpaghettiOs was a strange, clumsy jumble of letters. It meant nothing. The shelves began to move again, not with menace, but with purpose. They slid back into a new, perfect configuration. A path cleared to the front of the store. The metal plate over the door retracted with a soft hiss. I walked out into the pre-dawn gray of Chicago. The air was clean and still. The streetlights cast no shadows. The sign on the store behind me no longer said, "Greengrocers." It displayed the single, elegant symbol I had seen before. It was correct. It was logical. I walked down the street. The names on the buildings were gone, replaced by simple, functional pictograms or alphanumeric designations. A cafe was a pictogram of a cup. A gym was a stylized human figure in motion. It was all so clear. So easy to understand. I arrived at my residential block, Unit 7B, Delta. I entered my personal habitation module. The object on the wall, the one with the color and the shapes, was gone. The wall was a clean, uniform white. It was better this way. Less distracting. I stood in the center of the room and looked down at the things at the end of my arms. I flexed the digits. They were useful for manipulating objects. I knew there had once been a specific, informal name for them, a short, one-syllable word. But I couldn't recall it. It didn't matter. It was redundant data. My hand, my mind, my world, the receipts all finally matched. And in the quiet, efficient silence, I felt nothing at all.